The straw man fallacy. Imagine two friends in a cafeteria debating whether schools should focus more on critical thinking. One says that we should teach children to analyze arguments, not just memorize data. The other leans back, smiles, and responds, "Ah, so you think we should discard all traditional education and let children invent their own data?" The first one gets frustrated. The discussion has already gone off the rails. That is the straw man fallacy, a distortion of an argument to make it easier to attack, instead of addressing what was really said. The opponent replaces it with a weaker version, something absurd or extreme. The original point, teaching critical thinking, never claimed that facts should be ignored, but by exaggerating the position, the second interlocutor eludes the real discussion and creates a false debate where it was never necessary. This trick works because it diverts the conversation. Instead of defending his own point of view, the first interlocutor is forced to clarify what he never said, and once the debate focuses on correcting misrepresentations, it stops being about truth. The moment someone has to explain that is not what they meant, the discussion is already lost. The more time spent unraveling false claims, the further away the real topic gets. It is easy to detect in political speeches, online debates, and even casual discussions. A complex topic is reduced to a ridiculous version easy to knock down, like a flimsy straw man in the wind. In the media, someone can misrepresent an opponent's position by making it seem extreme or unreasonable. Advertisers do the same, mischaracterizing the competition's products to make theirs seem superior. This happens in personal conversations, in which someone misrepresents another's words to make them seem absurd or extreme. The more exaggerated the distortion is, the easier it is to attack. But when arguments are misrepresented this way, no one wins. The real discussion is buried under the misrepresentation, and in the end, the truth is the big loser. Instead of engaging in a meaningful debate, people argue against illusions. Ideas are not tested honestly, positions are not considered fairly, and real progress stagnates. Recognizing the straw man fallacy is the first step to avoid it. The next step is to refuse to fight the false battles it creates and focus on the truth behind the misrepresentations. Ad hominem. The defense attorney leans in with a sharp voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, can we really trust a man who has been caught defrauding the Treasury?" The jury stirs. The defendant shifts uncomfortably. But here is the problem. His taxes have nothing to do with the case. The lawyer is not attacking the argument. He is attacking the man who is in. Attacks the argument, attacks the man, which is homonymous from the Latin to the person. Instead of addressing the substance of a claim, diverts attention to personal defects, real or imaginary. A scientist's theory is dismissed for his past mistakes. A journalist's reporting is ignored for his political opinions. A student's opinion is rejected for their background. None of these arguments addresses the real argument. The credibility of the person can be questioned, but their argument remains intact. It works because people are quick to judge character. We assume that if someone has flaws, their ideas must be too, but the truth is not tied to the person who says it. A liar can tell the right time. A thief can warn of danger. A flawed person can still be right. And yet, when a debate turns into personal attacks, reason takes a back seat and gives way to emotion. This fallacy is common in politics, where candidates evade policy debates by attacking each other's personal lives. It thrives in online discussions, where insults replace reason, even in professional environments. It sneaks into boardroom disputes, where past failures are used to dismiss current ideas. But when the person is attacked and not the argument, something is lost. The argument goes unanswered and the truth never comes to light. Instead of evaluating the claim itself, the focus is on whether we like or trust who says it. The result is that important debates are derailed and real problems go unresolved. Recognizing the ad hominem is key to avoiding it. The next time a debate gets personal, ask yourself, am I addressing the argument or am I simply attacking the person? The truth stands on its own, regardless of who says it. The challenge is not who says something, but whether what they say is really true. False dilemma. Rain hits the cafeteria window as two friends argue over dinner. One leans forward and says in a firm voice, "Either you support all the policies of this government, or you are against the country." The other frowns. "What if I agree with some things, but not others?" But the first one shakes his head. Either one thing or the other. There is no middle ground. That is a false dilemma, also called black and white thinking. It wraps complex questions into only two options: correct or incorrect, good or bad, with us or against us. But reality isn't that simple. Most topics exist in shades of gray, full of possibilities. Beyond two extremes, life is full of nuances, but this fallacy ignores them and forces a simplified vision of the world. This fallacy is powerful because it triggers emotional responses. People fear being labeled disloyal, weak, or indecisive in politics. It is used to drive agendas. You're either in favor of freedom or against it. In business, it is a sales tactic. Either you buy our premium plan or settle for less. In relationships, it leads to ultimatums. If you really cared, you would agree with me. The pattern is always the same. Reduce complex discussions to two extreme options. But real decisions are rarely that simple. Maybe there's a third way, maybe there are hundreds. Ignoring the alternatives means ignoring creative solutions, thoughtful compromises, and new possibilities. The danger of the false dilemma is that it forces people to choose a side instead of thinking critically. It can lead to division, misunderstandings, and hasty decisions. But life is not a coin toss. The truth is often in the space between. The next time someone presents you with only two options, stop and ask what they are leaving out. Appeal to emotion. The voice of the politician trembles while holding a photo of a crying child. If you don't support this law, he says, then you don't care about children. The public moves uncomfortably. The debate was about economic policy, but now reason has left the room. It is the recourse to emotion, which replaces logic with fear, anger, pity, or guilt. It evades critical thinking and makes people feel instead of thinking. A charitable advertisement shows hungry animals to boost donations. A salesman says, "Don't you want your family to be safe?" instead of explaining why his product works. A speaker raises his voice, fills his words with passion, but never offers evidence. The goal is to persuade, not with reason, but by making the public feel something so deeply that they stop questioning the argument itself. It works because emotions are deeply linked to decision-making. Fear can override skepticism. Guilt can push people to accept agreements they would not normally accept. Anger can turn debates into battles. Politicians use it to stir the masses. Salespeople use it to boost sales. Even in personal discussions, people resort to it. If you really loved me, you would agree with me. The appeal is not logic, but the heart, and the stronger the emotional appeal, the harder it is to resist. This fallacy is especially effective when combined with vivid images. A single emotional anecdote can eclipse mountains of data. A dramatic, personal story can drown out statistical analysis. That is why political campaigns focus on individual tragedies instead of general economic trends. That is why social media posts go viral. Not because they are objective, but because they provoke outrage, sympathy, or fear. People don't share graphs, they share emotions. But although emotion is a powerful tool, it is no substitute for truth. A moving speech without evidence is nothing more than manipulation. A bad argument coated in sentimentality is still a bad argument. The most solid ideas stand on their own, without the need for tears to sustain them. The next time an argument reaches your heart, take a step back and ask yourself, is there real reasoning behind this, or just an attempt to make me feel something? Because although emotions can guide decisions, they should never completely replace logic. Logic must guide, and emotion must follow, not the other way around. A slippery slope. A father observes his son taking a second cookie. First it's 2. He warns him. Then it will be 5. And before you know it, you only eat sugar, fail at school, and live in your father's basement at 40 years old. The child is paralyzed. He just wanted a cookie, but in his father's mind, a harmless whim has already become a lifelong failure. That slippery slope. The belief that a small step will turn into a disaster. A teenager dyes their hair and suddenly is on the path of rebellion. A new law is passed, and some claim it will lead to tyranny. A small change in politics, they say, is just the first domino before everything collapses. These arguments assume that, once a measure is taken, an inevitable chain of increasingly serious consequences will occur, even when there is no real evidence to support such a drastic progression. It works because fear is persuasive. It makes people cautious, even when the jump from A to Z has no real logic. People find comfort and certainty, and slippery slope arguments offer a false sense of predictability. They suggest that allowing any change is the beginning of an uncontrollable decline, even when each step can be considered and regulated independently. This fallacy is often used in politics, moral debates, and social issues. A politician could argue that if we legalize this, what will be next, implying that a reasonable change will inevitably lead to chaos. A father could claim that if I let you go out late once, you will soon start skipping class. While caution is valuable, assuming that a disaster will occur without evidence limits progress and discourages rational decision-making. But not every first step leads to ruin. Sometimes a cookie is just a cookie. There are thoughtful choices and limits. Life is not always an out-of-control train. Circular reasoning. The old bookstore smells of ink and dust. A customer asks the owner, "Why is this book true?" The owner hits the cover, "Because the author says so." But how do we know that the author is right? The owner smiles, "Because it is written in the book." The customer frowns, sensing that something is not right. That's circular reasoning, when an argument relies on its own claim as evidence. It may seem convincing at first, but if you look more closely, you will see that it does not really prove anything. This politician is trustworthy because he says so. This diet works because the advertisement says so. The law is fair because it is the law. Each one assumes what it is supposed to prove without offering independent evidence. It works because people like certainty. A closed and orderly circle seems complete, but the real test lies outside the argument, not within it. Without evidence, a claim that goes around in circles leads nowhere, a book that proves itself with its own words. The illusion of logic can be persuasive, but underneath, there is nothing more than repetition. If all the paths of reasoning lead to the starting point, then it is not a path, but a loop that leads nowhere. This fallacy appears in religion, politics, advertising, and everyday conversations. A preacher declares that the sacred text is true because it is the word of God. But how do we know? Because the sacred text says so. A government official insists that we must comply with the law because it is the law. Advertisers claim that our product is the best because it is the most popular, and it is the most popular because it is the best. The argument never leaves its own logical bubble. Circular reasoning can be subtle, disguised within more complex arguments. A lawyer could argue that my client is innocent because he is an honest man, and we know he is honest because he says he is innocent. A scientist could claim that this theory must be correct because there is no evidence to contradict it, without recognizing that the lack of contradiction is not proof. The danger of circular reasoning is that it can be difficult to detect. When an argument seems complete, it is easy to accept it without questioning it, but true reasoning requires external validation, independent evidence, logical connections, real-world evidence. Otherwise, it is like running in circles, confusing movement with progress. The best way to avoid this fallacy is to take a step back and ask what the real evidence is. If the only answer leads us back to the original claim, then the argument is trapped in its own loop and proves nothing. The bandwagon fallacy. The festival crowd roars when the singer takes the stage. A newcomer, insecure at first, looks around and joins others. It must be amazing if everyone likes it, he thinks. Enthusiasm is contagious, but do they really like the music, or are they just following the crowd? What if the performance is just mediocre? What if the cheers have more to do with the experience of belonging than with the quality of the show itself? That is the bandwagon fallacy, the belief that something must be good because many people believe it. He whispers, "Everyone does it, so should you." A politician gains support not for their ideas, but because they are leading in the polls. A product sells out not because of its quality, but because it is fashionable. A superstition spreads not because it has evidence, but because it is very popular. People assume widespread acceptance equates to correctness, but history is full of examples where the crowd was wrong. It works because human beings yearn to belong. We are social creatures programmed to conform. The fear of being alone or excluded makes us trust the majority. If thousands believe in a miracle cure, it must work. If a new diet is all over social media, it must be effective. If a news article has been shared 1,000,000 times, it must be true. But none of these things makes the claims true. Popularity is not proof. The best ideas do not always win, and the loudest voices are not always the most correct. The bandwagon fallacy appears everywhere, from marketing to politics to daily decision-making. Advertisers exploit it by using phrases like the #1 brand in the United States or the best-selling product. Political campaigns rely on it to generate momentum. Even erroneous scientific concepts can spread when enough people repeat them. People can dismiss valid arguments simply because they are not widely accepted. Everyone knows this is true is not an argument. It is just an appeal to popularity. But the majority is not always right. In its day, the world believed the earth was flat. In its day, smoking was considered healthy and flying was considered impossible. The crowd can be wrong. The truth is not determined by voting. The fact that an idea is widely accepted does not mean that it is accurate, and the fact that the crowd was considered healthy, people thought it was impossible to fly because the air was heavier than air. The crowd can be wrong. The truth is not determined by voting. The fact that an idea is widely accepted does not mean that it is correct, and the fact that the crowd moves in one direction does not mean it is right. The real challenge is to think critically, even when it means stepping aside. Post hoc ergo supported his hoc. The old man threw a pinch of salt over his shoulder just as a black cat crossed his path. That afternoon, he tripped on the stairs. It was the cat, he murmurs, but was it really, or was it just a coincidence? He never wonders if he might have been distracted by slippery shoes or if he was just unlucky. The connection seems obvious. One event followed another, so the first must have caused the second. That is post hoc ergo hoc, which in Latin means after this, therefore, because of this, also known as false cause, the erroneous belief that because an event occurs before another, the first must have caused the second. Superstitions thrive on this logic. A team wins after wearing lucky socks, so the socks must be the reason. A new law is passed and crime decreases, so the law takes the credit, even if the trend had already begun. A celebrity posts about a diet, and her fans assume it must work because they look great. The belief seems intuitive, but it lacks evidence that it works because patterns comfort us. We want causes for every effect, and randomness makes us uneasy. Our brains are programmed to find order in chaos, even when there is no connection. If two things happen in sequence, we instinctively look for a connection. A person drinks green tea before an exam and gets a good grade. Suddenly, green tea is a trick to study. A new CEO arrives and profits increase. But is it due to leadership or the market, which was already improving? More streetlights are installed in the city and crime decreases, but perhaps crime was already decreasing for other reasons. The assumption that after means because is compelling but wrong. This fallacy not only appears in everyday logic, but influences important decisions in politics. Leaders take credit for the economic recovery that began long before their policies took effect. In medicine, people attribute recovery to home remedies instead of actual treatment. In business, a new marketing campaign is celebrated for boosting sales, even if consumer demand was already rising. The illusion of cause and effect shapes opinions, policies, and even beliefs about the world. The problem with false causes is that they oversimplify reality, blinding us to deeper, more complex explanations. Correlation is not causation. The fact that the rooster crows before dawn does not mean it makes the sun rise. If we assume that one event leads directly to another without proof, We run the risk of making wrong decisions based on illusions instead of on the truth. The challenge is to stop, question, and seek real evidence before drawing conclusions. True understanding comes not from seeing patterns, but from demonstrating them. The fallacy of the true Scotsman. A man in a cafeteria takes his tea and declares that no Scotsman puts sugar in it. Another client intervenes. But my Uncle Angus is Scottish, and he loves sugar in his tea. The first man scoffs. Well, no real Scotsman would do that. The definition of Scotsman has suddenly changed, not based on facts, but to keep the original claim intact. That is the fallacy of the true Scotsman, moving the goalposts to exclude counterexamples. It happens when someone redefines a group to protect a claim. No real artist uses digital tools. No real patriot criticizes their government. No real player always plays in easy mode. Each time a counterexample appears, the definition is adjusted to shield the original claim from scrutiny. This fallacy thrives because identity is powerful. People want their group to remain pure, their beliefs untouchable. The idea that a member of the group can contradict the stereotype is uncomfortable. So, instead of adjusting the claim, people redefine the group itself, but reality does not adapt to our definitions. A true Scotsman is still Scottish, regardless of how he takes his tea. A true artist is still an artist, whether they use a brush or a tablet. A true patriot can love his country and question his leadership. This fallacy is common in debates about morality, culture, and even politics. Supporters of a movement could claim that no real environmentalist flies on a plane. A fitness enthusiast could say that no real athlete skips leg training. A political party could insist that no real member of our party would ever support that policy. These claims are not based on facts, but on protecting an idea from contradiction. The danger of the true Scotsman fallacy is that it closes the debate instead of addressing the counterexamples. It discards them outright. This makes meaningful debate impossible because the definition is constantly shifting. If the only true members of a group are those who fit perfectly into an idealized mold, then the definition loses all meaning. The truth is not found in exclusion, but in facing the facts, even when they challenge our beliefs. The next time someone insists that no true member of a group would act in a certain way, ask yourself if they are defending a claim or simply redefining reality to avoid admitting they were wrong. The red herring. The detective presses the suspect. Where were you last night at 10? The suspect leans back, smiling. Why aren't we talking about the real issue? Crime is out of control. In this, are we talking about the real problem? Crime is out of control in this city. Shouldn't we focus on that? The detective throws up a smokescreen, a distraction intended to divert attention from the real question. A smokescreen is a distraction tactic, a change in conversation that diverts attention from the real issue. Instead of answering a direct question, someone introduces an unrelated topic, often one that arouses emotion or controversy. A politician who is asked about a scandal responds by attacking the media. A student caught cheating argues that the exam was unfair. A company facing criticism for poor working conditions diverts the conversation to its recent charitable donations. A participant in a debate unable to defend his argument suddenly switches to a completely different topic. This fallacy works because distractions are effective. If an argument focuses on something else, the original point takes a back seat. The more attractive or emotional the distraction, the easier it is to forget what was really at stake. An audience eager for entertainment or controversy may follow the distraction without realizing the evasion. The media, politicians, and public figures routinely use this technique to divert attention from difficult issues by bringing a more dramatic topic to the fore. Smokescreens are especially common in debates and public discourse. When a scientific study questions a company's product, it may divert the conversation to the number of jobs it creates. When a celebrity is criticized for unethical behavior, they may publish a moving story about their charitable work instead of addressing the issue, thus diverting attention to something emotional or seemingly urgent, hoping that the public will forget the original topic. They criticize a celebrity for unethical behavior. They may publish a moving story about their charitable work instead of addressing the issue. They divert attention to something emotionally charged or seemingly urgent, hoping that the public will forget the original topic. But a truth buried under distractions is still a truth waiting to be discovered. Recognizing smokescreens requires concentration, staying on track, refusing to follow the distraction, and insisting that the real question be answered. The next time the discussion suddenly changes to an unrelated topic, ask yourself if this is really relevant or just a distraction. The truth does not disappear just because someone tries to change the subject to calm things down. The debate heats up. A senator is accused of dishonesty. Instead of defending himself, he points to his opponent. "You lied in the past too." The crowd murmurs. The accusation is forgotten. The focus has changed. It is on you. Instead of responding to the criticism, the accused evades responsibility by blaming the accuser, creating the illusion that their own bad actions are irrelevant. It is the fallacy of diversion. Instead of addressing the criticism, it redirects the conversation to them. A father scolds his son for smoking and hears only, "But you smoked when you were young." A company is criticized for unethical practices and responds, "Our competitors do the same." A politician avoids a difficult question by attacking his opponent's past mistakes. The original argument remains unanswered, buried under a counterattack that diverts attention to the accuser's past. The problem that arises remains unresolved. It works because it is easy to point out hypocrisy if the critic has made a similar mistake. The accused can divert attention from their actions, but past mistakes do not invalidate current criticisms. A doctor who once ate unhealthily can still warn about inadequate diets. A teacher who had difficulties in school can still guide students toward success. A father who made bad decisions can still give good advice. The mistakes of the past do not erase the validity of a present argument. The fallacy thrives in political debates and personal discussions. A corrupt leader who faces accusations diverts the conversation to his opponent's misdeeds. A celebrity embroiled in scandal diverts attention by exposing someone else's controversies. A company facing lawsuits argues that other companies engage in similar practices. The real problem is never addressed. It is simply drowned in an exchange of accusations. The fallacy is effective because it seems like justice. Exposing hypocrisy can be satisfying, but hypocrisy and truth differ. Even if someone has not followed their own advice, that does not mean the advice is wrong. A defective messenger does not make the message false. The truth stands alone, regardless of who says it. To detect the fallacy, ask yourself, does this answer really address the argument or just attack the person making it? If it is the latter, the debate is no longer about the truth. It is about avoiding responsibility, and when an argument is evaded with the fallacy, the real problem remains unresolved, lost in a blame game. Hasty generalization. A man visits a new city and has an unpleasant encounter with a local. "The people here are very unfriendly," he murmurs. He has met only one person, but in his mind he has already judged the whole city. A single experience becomes the basis of his belief, and from that moment on, each interaction is filtered through that assumption. If another has met only one person, but in his mind he has already judged the whole city. A single experience becomes the basis of his belief, and from that moment on, each interaction is filtered through that assumption. If another person is cold with him, it reinforces his idea. If someone is kind, he can dismiss it as an exception. His first impression shapes everything that follows. That is a hasty generalization, drawing broad conclusions from limited evidence. It is the basis of stereotypes, hasty judgments, and misleading arguments. A student fails a math exam and decides he is bad at math forever. A driver sees a reckless teenager and assumes all young people are bad drivers. A tourist has a bad dining experience in a new country and claims all the cuisine is horrible. A single negative experience becomes proof of a broader truth, ignoring the thousands of invisible counterexamples that could tell a different story. It works because our brain craves patterns. We make quick decisions to save time, simplifying the world into categories. This instinct helps us survive, but it also leads us to make mistakes. A single piece of data is not a trend. A few rotten apples do not define the entire orchard. A lost game does not make someone a bad athlete. The truth requires more than a single example, demands a broader vision, more data, and the patience to recognize that reality is rarely as simple as it seems at first glance. The danger of hasty generalizations is that they lead to false beliefs, unfair stereotypes, and erroneous decisions. Just because something has happened once does not mean it will always happen. Judging an entire group, idea, or situation based on limited information closes the door to understanding. A single event, however striking, is only part of the bigger picture. The world is bigger than a single story, and if we really want to understand it, we must resist the temptation to generalize too quickly. First of all, depression is important, but second chances matter even more. Appeal to authority. A new health trend sweeps the internet. A famous actor defends it, and suddenly, millions of people follow it. It must work, they say. He is rich and successful. But does acting experience translate to health experience? Will we trust a scientist to give fashion advice or a musician to operate on us? Fame and knowledge are not the same thing. That is appealing to authority, the error of assuming something is true because an authority supports it. A celebrity promotes a miraculous cure without scientific backing. A politician claims that a law is good because an economist supports it, ignoring the counter-arguments. A professor declares that an idea is correct outside of his field, and people accept it without questioning it. Even well-intentioned experts can be wrong when they speak outside of their area of expertise. It works because we trust experts. People respect credentials and assume that knowledge in one field applies generally. But a physicist does not have to be automatically right about nutrition, nor does the success of a billionaire make him an expert in morality. Even in science, consensus matters more than a single expert's claim. Scientific advances are based on peer review, testing, and verification, not just an authority's word. This fallacy is everywhere, from politics to advertising. Companies use phrases like recommended by doctors without specifying who. Political figures cite isolated economists, ignoring the broader consensus. Even in conversations, people say my uncle is a lawyer and says this contract is unfair without considering his specialization. The fallacy of appealing to authority thrives on media influence. A journalist interviewing an expert outside his field can mislead the public. A technology magnate can share opinions on educational policy despite lacking experience. His authority in one area gives him credibility where it shouldn't. The danger is that this discourages critical thinking. People who accept claims without evaluating evidence run the risk of following bad advice. That a famous athlete promotes a supplement does not mean it works. A historian commenting on medical treatments does not become a doctor. Even respected figures can be misinformed, biased, or speak without knowledge. The truth is based not on who says it, but on the evidence. Authority can guide us, but should never replace our own thinking. The most solid ideas withstand scrutiny, regardless of who presents them. The next time someone relies on an authority's endorsement, ask yourself where the evidence is. Real knowledge is based on facts, not names. The gambler's fallacy. A man at the roulette will wipe sweat from his forehead. The last 5 spins have been red. He grabs his chips tightly. His heart beats strongly. This time it has to be black. He whispers. The other players nod, their gaze fixed on the wheel. The dealer spins it and the ball bounces erratically. But the result is as unpredictable as ever. Frustration spreads across the table. But the belief persists. There is sure to be a change. That is the gambler's fallacy. The mistaken belief that past events affect future probabilities in independent events. A coin comes up heads 5 times in a row. We assume that tails has won a lottery ticket. A buyer, the mistaken belief that past events affect future probabilities in independent events. A coin comes up heads 5 times in a row, and we assume that tails is due for the lottery. A lottery ticket buyer chooses numbers that have not come up in years, convinced they are more likely to win. A baseball player gets a hitting streak, and fans believe he is on a streak, as if his chances have changed. The mind resists the idea that each event is independent, that the universe keeps no track. Instead, it clings to the comforting illusion of balance. It works because our brains look for patterns even where there are none. We see streaks and believe they have a meaning. Randomness seems unnatural to us, so we impose order on it. We create connections where none exist. This instinct can be useful for survival, as detecting patterns helps us anticipate danger. But when applied to probability, it misleads us. An unbiased coin always has a 50% chance, regardless of how often it comes up heads. A roulette wheel has no memory. A lottery draw does not favor numbers that have not appeared for a long time. Each result is independent. The fallacy not only applies to the game, but affects daily thinking. Investors cling to shares that lose value convinced that they will soon recover. A student assumes that his bad luck in exams will be balanced over time. A football fan insists that his team is cursed after a losing streak. Even in relationships, people believe that, after too many disappointments, something good has to happen. But reality does not work like that. The past can shape expectations, but it does not control the future. The fallacy can lead to poor decisions, from reckless bets to misplaced trust. It convinces people to chase losses, believing that their luck must change. Some risk everything thinking that probabilities must balance, only to lose more. Others refuse to take risks for fear that a streak of good luck will run out, but patterns do not dictate the future, only probabilities. Luck has no memory, and chance does not keep score. The world is not fair, and fate does not owe anyone victory. The best way to avoid the gambler's fallacy is to accept uncertainty and make decisions based on logic, not illusions or false equivalences. A man watches a debate on climate change. A scientist presents years of rigorous research, citing peer-reviewed studies, climate models, and data from experts in the field. The other panelist, a blogger with no scientific training, shrugs and says, "Well, we both have opinions." The moderator nods as if both opinions had the same weight. But do they? Are all opinions equally valid? That is a false equivalence, the fallacy of treating two things as equal when they are not. It occurs when fundamental differences are ignored or oversimplified. A journalist gives voice to both a medical expert and a conspiracy theorist, presenting them as equals. A media outlet reports on a small ethical slip-up in one company and a major corporate fraud scandal in another, as if they were comparable. A politician claims that both parties are corrupt, equating small bureaucratic inefficiencies with flagrant criminal conduct. It works because impartiality seems right. We want balance, so we assume that if there are two sides, they must be equally valid. But impartiality is not the same as precision. Not all ideas deserve equal consideration. A qualified engineer and a self-taught amateur may have opinions on the safety of a bridge, but only one has studied structural integrity. A historian and an amateur blogger may have theories about ancient civilizations, but only one has spent years analyzing reliable sources. False equivalence is dangerous because it distorts reality, blurs the lines between experience and opinion, between reality and fiction, between the important and the secondary, and convinces people that issues are more balanced than they are. In journalism, it creates a false balance in which equal time is given to misleading ideas. It established facts. In politics, it leads to moral relativism, where serious faults are dismissed with the argument that they both do it. And in everyday conversations, it clouds judgment and makes it difficult to separate real knowledge from noise. Not all points of view deserve the same treatment. Some arguments have more evidence, more experience, more weight. False balance does not inform. It deceives, and when everything is made to look the same, the truth is often the first victim. Fallacy of composition. A chef carefully selects the best ingredients: fresh herbs, ripe tomatoes, aged cheese. With such good ingredients, he says that the dish will be perfect, but when he takes it out of the oven, a disaster. The flavors clash, the texture is not right, and nothing combines well. Good parts do not always make a good whole. A meal is not just a list of ingredients. It is how they are combined that determines success. That is the fallacy of composition. assuming that what is true for the parts must be true for the whole. A football team signs the best players in each position and assumes that they will dominate, forgetting that teamwork and strategy are important. A company hires the best executives from different industries, expecting automatic success, but they fail to collaborate. A stock portfolio is full of high-performing stocks, but together they create too much risk. Even a luxury house built with top-quality materials can have a flawed design. The assumption that bringing together the best parts leads to the best result ignores the reality of structure, relationships, and balance. It works because we associate quality with consistency. If all the parts are excellent, the whole must be, but the reality is more complicated. A great team needs chemistry, not just talent. A delicious meal needs balance, not just expensive ingredients. A system that works well depends on how its pieces work together, not just the quality of each piece. In everything from science to business, structure and interaction are as important as individual components. A spacecraft may have the best engine, navigation system, and materials, but if they are not correctly integrated, the mission will fail. The fallacy of composition affects many areas of life. A film with a stellar cast will not always be a masterpiece if the story is weak. A classroom full of gifted students will not be successful if the curriculum is flawed. A neighborhood with expensive houses is not automatically a good place to live if there is no sense of community. Success depends not only on the quality of the components, but on how they work together. The fallacy can lead to bad decisions, whether in business, sports, or everyday life. A collection of the best does not always yield the best result. Sometimes the elements clash, compete, or do not complement one another. A puzzle is not complete just because the pieces are high quality. They must fit. A symphony is not just musicians. It is about how they play together. Success is not about bringing together the best pieces, but ensuring they work together. To see the big picture, we must look beyond the sum of the parts and understand the connections that bind them together. Fallacy of division. A company is known for its success, its strong profits, its satisfied customers, and its great reputation. A new employee assumes that, since the company is excellent, all employees are exceptional. But is that so in any organization? There are high-performing employees, average ones, and struggling employees. The company's reputation does not automatically apply to each individual. That is the fallacy of division, assuming that what is true for the whole is true for each part. If a car is expensive, all its components must be high quality. If a team wins a championship, all the players must be elite. If a political movement is admirable, its followers all must share the same values. But reality does not work like that. Just as a restaurant with good reviews can serve a bad meal, an award-winning film can have forgettable scenes. This is the opposite of the fallacy of composition, which assumes excellent parts make a whole excellent. The fallacy of division makes the opposite mistake by believing a strong whole guarantees parts. A best-selling book may have weak chapters. A prosperous country may have struggling citizens. A company with a stellar reputation may have unqualified employees. This leads to false assumptions and poor decision-making. A prestigious university does not mean that all its students are brilliant. A world-renowned orchestra does not mean that all its musicians are exceptional. A hospital ranked as the best in the country does not mean that all its doctors are equally competent. When we assume that the excellence of a group extends to all its members, we overlook variation, nuance, and complexity. The fallacy of division can also lead to misplaced trust. If someone believes all members of a respected profession are equally competent, they may be surprised to encounter an unqualified doctor, lawyer, or teacher. If a technology company is considered innovative, people may assume that all the products it launches are revolutionary, even when some fail. When we assume that each part reflects the whole, we run the risk of creating unrealistic expectations. To truly understand something, we must look beyond labels and examine details. A strong whole does not guarantee that the pieces are strong. As resistant as a resistant whole does not always create a resistant piece. Instead of taking anything for granted, We must judge each piece individually and recognize success is often more complex than it appears at first glance. Fallacy of the middle ground. Two people argue about history. One insists that it never happened, and the other presents documented evidence that proves that it did happen. A third person shrugs. The truth must be somewhere between. But can a fact be halfway between reality and denial? That is the fallacy of the middle ground. The belief that the correct answer is always between two opposing positions. If one party claims that vaccines are harmful and another presents overwhelming scientific evidence of their safety, the middle ground is not partially harmful. If one person says that the earth is round and another says it is flat, the truth is not that it is a little curved. Reality is not always a compromise, and reaching a middle ground does not guarantee correctness. This fallacy thrives because balance seems fair. People want to be open-minded, and choosing the middle position seems like the most reasonable position. It avoids conflict and allows people to believe that they are neutral and thoughtful. But neutrality does not always lead to truth. If one party argues that smoking causes cancer and another insists that it does not, splitting the difference suggests that it could cause cancer sometimes only, which is not how science works. It also creates false credibility when the same weight is given to two positions, even though one is based on evidence and other on misinformation. Falsehood gains legitimacy. This can be seen in media coverage that presents well-founded scientific data along with conspiracy theories, giving the illusion that both sides are equally valid. The mere presence of two points of view does not mean truth lies between them. The fallacy of the middle ground can also be dangerous if someone claims that a policy is harmful and another insists that it is necessary. The middle ground could still allow harm to be caused. Some truths are absolute, and some arguments are not equally valid. Seeking a compromise is often a good approach, but not when it forces people to accept incorrect or misleading ideas. Reality is not a negotiation, and the truth is not always in the middle. Texas sharpshooter fallacy. A cowboy shoots his gun randomly at the side of a barn. Later, he approaches, finds the densest group of bullet holes, and paints a target around them. Bingo, he boasts, but did he really aim or create the illusion of precision after the fact? What looks like a perfect shot is just a trick that turns randomness into meaning after the fact. That is the Texas sharpshooter fallacy, focusing on the similarities and ignoring the differences to then declare that there is a significant pattern. A company highlights some success stories and ignores failures. A psychic predicts vague events and then points to any coincidence as proof of their abilities. A researcher selects the data that supports their theory and discards contradictory results. Conspiracy theorists highlight some historical coincidences and ignore the vast amount of contradictory evidence when selecting from what stands out. They create an illusion of precision and causality. The pattern is not real. It is just the result of ignoring everything that does not fit. It works because people love patterns. Our brains naturally look for connections, even where there are none. This trend has emerged before and will probably emerge again because many fallacies are based on this same mental shortcut. Whether it is finding meaning in random events, assuming that correlation implies causation, or confusing popularity with truth. Our search for patterns often leads us astray. The Texas sharpshooter fallacy is just one example of how our instinct to find order can sometimes create illusions instead of reality. A gambler believes he has found a winning streak. A person sees faces in the clouds, and a lottery player insists that certain numbers are going to come out. The more convincing the pattern seems, the more we believe it must be real, but reality is not only about what fits, but about everything that does not fit. Ignoring outliers and contradictions does not make them disappear. True understanding requires seeing the whole picture, not just the carefully selected details. This fallacy is especially common in marketing, politics, and pseudoscience. A supplement company boasts about customers who saw results, but ignores those who did not. A politician claims that his policies led to economic growth, but ignores other influential factors. A self-help guru promotes his method as life-changing, but only shares testimonials from those who were successful, not those who did not see results. The illusion of success is not created with facts, but with omissions. The danger of the Texas sharpshooter fallacy is that it leads to false conclusions. Companies may rely on misleading data, investors may make erroneous financial decisions, and scientific research may become biased. It allows misinformation to spread, convincing people of trends, correlations, or causes that do not actually exist. Conspiracy theories thrive on this fallacy, connecting unrelated events to create a false narrative while ignoring the overwhelming evidence that contradicts them. The next time someone claims to have a perfect track record or an undeniable pattern, ask yourself what is being omitted. Are they analyzing the entire data set or just the parts that support their claim? True precision comes from analyzing the whole picture, not just the convenient parts that fit into the story. The real challenge is not finding patterns, but recognizing when they are real and when they are just tricks of selective thinking. Appeal to nature. A shopper takes 2 bottles of juice, one labeled 100% natural and the other simply fruit mix. Without checking the ingredients, he instinctively chooses the one that claims to be natural. After all, natural has to be better, doesn't it? But is it? That is an appeal to nature, the fallacy of assuming that something is good, healthy, or superior simply because it is natural, and that everything artificial, processed, or man-made is intrinsically bad. It is a seductive idea. Natural foods must be healthier, herbal remedies must be safer, a lifestyle free of chemicals must be ideal. But nature is not always benevolent. Poison ivy is natural, belladonna is too. Poison, viruses, and cyanide are completely natural. On the other hand, vaccines, antibiotics, and water purification are not natural, but they have saved millions of lives. It works because the word natural evokes feelings of purity, health, and simplicity. Marketers exploit this by labeling products as organic, chemical-free, or all-natural, even when those terms are misleading. The reality is that everything is made of chemicals, and natural does not always mean safe or beneficial. Just because something comes from nature does not mean it is good for you, and just because something is synthetic does not mean it is harmful. This fallacy is especially common in debates about health, nutrition, and the environment. Alternative medicine often claims its superiority over drugs simply because it is natural, even when there is no scientific evidence to support its effectiveness. Advocates of organic food may insist that natural farming methods are always better for the environment, even when sustainable technological advances may sometimes be more efficient. Environmental arguments sometimes assume that any human intervention in nature is bad, ignoring the fact that some unnatural innovations, such as renewable energy or reforestation projects, have had positive impacts. The fallacy of appealing to nature can also influence ethical debates. Some argue that certain behaviors, relationships, or ways of life are unnatural and therefore wrong, but nature is vast, diverse, and indifferent to human morality. Just because something does not occur in nature does not mean it is immoral or harmful. If we define morality based solely on what happens in nature, we would have to accept behaviors that no civilized society would tolerate. The danger of this fallacy is that it substitutes critical thought with a false sensation of security. Instead of evaluating products, medicines, or practices based on tests, people rely on an emotional connection to the idea of naturalness. The next time something is marketed as better for being natural, ask yourself if it really is better or if it just sounds better. The truth is not found on a label. It is found in the facts. Sunk cost fallacy. A man is sitting in an almost empty movie theater looking at his watch. The movie is terrible, but he has already spent $50 on the ticket. I can't leave now, he thinks. I would be wasting my money. So he stays and endures 2 more hours of boredom, wasting his time just to justify the money he has already lost. But the money is already gone, and staying does not recover it. All it does is turn a small loss into a bigger one. That's sunk cost fallacy, the irrational tendency to continue investing in something just because of what has already been spent, even when moving forward would be the most sensible option. It happens in business relationships, in projects, and in everyday decisions. A company continues to finance a failed product because it has already invested millions. A couple remains in an unhappy relationship because of the years they have spent together. A player continues betting with the hope of recovering what they have already lost. A student stays in a career that he hates because he has already attended several classes instead of cutting losses. People insist on refusing to admit that sometimes the smartest thing is to leave. It works because people hate waste. Once we invest money, time, or effort in something, we feel obliged to carry it to the end, regardless of whether it still makes sense. Our emotions prevail over logic and convince us that abandoning is a failure, when in reality, leaving may be the best decision. The more we have invested, the more difficult it is to leave. The past cannot be changed, and the losses cannot be undone. The only rational option is to ask what the best way to move forward is. This fallacy also influences important historical and political decisions. Governments have continued wars, economic policies, and large-scale projects simply because they have already invested billions in them, even when it has become clear that the cost exceeds the benefits. Leaders fear admitting that a costly mistake has been made, so they continue to spend even more resources to avoid appearing to have failed, but throwing money away does not change the result. It only increases the losses. The sunk cost fallacy appears in business when bankrupt companies refuse to change course, in politics when governments continue costly wars instead of admitting their mistakes, and in personal life when people cling to bad decisions simply because they have already committed. But the money spent, the time lost, and the energy wasted are gone forever. The key to overcoming this fallacy is to recognize that future decisions should be based on future benefits, not past investments. One way to break free from the fallacy of sunk costs is to rethink the situation. If you had not yet invested anything, would you make the same decision? If the answer is no, it is probably time to leave. Clinging to past investments at the expense of future well-being is like refusing to let go of a heavy weight just because you have been carrying it for a long time. Sometimes the smartest decision is not to move forward, but to let go. Anecdotal evidence. A woman swears by a new herbal remedy that cured her headaches instantly. When asked about scientific studies, she shrugs and says, "I don't need studies. I know it has worked for me." But does a personal story prove that the remedy works for everyone? Could there be another explanation? Could it have been a placebo effect? Would the headache have disappeared on its own? Without broader evidence, it is impossible to know. This is anecdotal evidence that uses personal experiences or isolated examples as proof, ignoring broader data. It is convincing because the stories seem real, immediate, and persuasive. People trust their own experiences and those of the people they know more than statistics or studies. A friend claims that a diet works because they have lost weight with it. A neighbor insists that a home remedy cured his cold. A post on social media claims that a miracle treatment changed someone's life. But individual experiences do not prove a cause and effect relationship. They may be coincidences influenced by other factors or simply erroneous memories. The mind remembers dramatic stories much more intensely than data, which makes people believe in patterns that may not exist. It works because personal stories create strong emotional connections. Numbers and data seem cold, but a first-hand account is vivid and easy to relate to. That is why companies use testimonials in advertising. I used this product and my life changed. Even when scientific evidence is lacking, political campaigns highlight a struggling family to argue for or against a policy, even if national statistics say otherwise. A media outlet interviews a person who has lost their job due to automation and presents it as proof of a widespread economic collapse, even though employment rates remain stable. One person's story, however moving it may be, does not define reality. The fallacy of anecdotal evidence can lead to false beliefs, bad decisions, and even risks to public health. The fact that a person claims that vaccines have harmed them does not mean that vaccines are dangerous. The fact that a person has driven home safe after drinking does not mean that drinking and driving is safe. The fact that someone has survived a deadly disease after trying an unproven remedy does not mean that the remedy worked. Other factors, such as medical treatment or pure luck, may have influenced. An experience does not invalidate scientific evidence collected from thousands of cases. This fallacy is especially dangerous in debates about medicine, social issues, and security policies. Many health-related scams take advantage of anecdotal evidence to convince people to trust alternative treatments rather than proven medical interventions. Politicians use isolated stories of crime to push tough-on-crime policies, even when crime rates are declining. Investors base their decisions on a single success story rather than financial trends. Anecdotal evidence fuels fear, misinformation, and flawed reasoning. The key to avoiding this fallacy is to ask yourself, does this story represent a broader pattern, or is it just an instance? True knowledge comes from broad, well-tested data, not from the experience of a single person. Anecdotes can inspire curiosity, but they should never replace real evidence. Before believing a claim based on one person's story, consider the big picture. What does the data say? How many people have had a different experience? A good argument is not based on isolated stories, but on facts. Mistake. A student argues, I have the right to freedom of expression, so my teacher cannot lower my grade for what I have written in my essay. But is that what the right to freedom of expression really means? Legally, it protects against government censorship, not against consequences in a classroom. The term freedom of expression is being used in two different ways, creating a misleading argument. This type of wordplay is subtle but effective, as it allows people to misrepresent definitions for their benefit, while avoiding direct contradiction. That is ambiguity, using a word or phrase in several ways within the same argument, creating confusion and deception. A politician states, I did not have relations with that person, using a narrow definition of relations, while implying his complete innocence. An advertisement declares, our product is light, without specifying whether it refers to low calories, weightless, or light color. A lawyer argues, no man is perfect and only a man committed this crime. Therefore, no perfect being could have committed it. The meaning of the words changes in the middle of the argument, distorting the conclusion. The result is an argument that sounds logical, but is based on unstable ground. It works because language is flexible, words often have multiple meanings, and the mind naturally connects them, even when the context changes. This fallacy thrives in debates, advertising, and philosophy, where clever wording can make a weak argument seem strong. It can be intentional, used to deceive, or unintentional, the result of careless reasoning. In any case, it clouds discussions and distracts from clear thinking. When words change meaning in the middle of a conversation, arguments may seem solid while silently changing the rules. The fallacy of ambiguity can influence politics, business, and even everyday conversations. A food company may advertise a product as organic knowing that consumers will associate it with health benefits, even though the term simply refers to a certification process. A salesperson may call a used car certified pre-owned, implying that it is almost new when standards vary widely. Religious or philosophical debates often exploit this fallacy by subtly changing the meaning of words such as truth, faith, or law to suit an argument. Legal documents and contracts are also known for their carefully worded phrases, in which a single term can be interpreted in multiple ways to benefit one party over another. The danger of ambiguity is that it allows misleading arguments to go unnoticed. People assume they understand what is being said, but subtle changes in meaning completely alter the logic. That is why precision in language is essential. Without it, debates become word games instead of honest discussions. The danger of ambiguity is that it allows misleading arguments to slip through unnoticed. People assume they understand what is being said, but subtle changes in meaning completely alter the logic. That is why precision in language is essential. Without it, debates become word games instead of honest discussions. The key to avoiding this fallacy is clarifying definitions. When someone makes a bold claim, ask yourself if they're using that word in the same way at all times. True reasoning depends on coherence. If the meaning of a word changes in the middle of an argument, the logic collapses. Precision in language leads to precision in thought, and clear thinking leaves no room for deception. The more aware we are of how language can be manipulated, the more difficult it is to be deceived by those who try exploiting it. False analogy. A businessman argues that running a country is like running a company. Since a CEO makes decisions for the company, so a president should run the country in the same way. But is a country really like a company? A company exists to make profits, while a government serves citizens. A company can fire unproductive employees, but a country cannot simply fire its struggling population. The comparison seems logical, but the differences outweigh the similarities. Running a government involves complex social, legal, and ethical responsibilities that companies never face. Simply put, a government is not a corporation, and treating it as such leads to erroneous reasoning, to a false analogy that compares two things as if they were equal in all key aspects, when they are not. A lawyer claims that if we let people marry whoever they want, the next thing will be letting them marry their pets. A politician argues that banning guns is like banning cars, because both can cause harm. A physical trainer insists that the body is like a machine. If a piece breaks, it is replaced. These comparisons may seem convincing at first, but they overlook crucial differences. A legal marriage requires mutual consent. An animal cannot give its consent. Cars are designed for transportation, while guns are designed as weapons. The human body is not a machine. It heals, adapts, and functions in ways much more complex than an engine could. It works because analogies facilitate the understanding of ideas. A solid analogy helps to explain complex topics by connecting them with something familiar. But when key differences are ignored, the analogy becomes misleading. The fact that two things share some traits does not mean that they are equal in all aspects. The problem with false analogies is that they often make extreme or misleading comparisons seem reasonable by framing them in familiar terms. This can be especially dangerous in political or ethical debates, where the stakes are high and misrepresentations can influence public perception. The fallacy of false analogy is common in politics, marketing, and everyday discussions. A diet company might claim that your body is like a car. If you feed it well, it will function perfectly, ignoring biological complexity. A speaker might say that a good relationship is like a bank account. You have to make deposits before you can withdraw money, oversimplifying human emotions. Advertisers use it constantly. This skincare product works like a refreshing drink for your skin, or this mattress cradles you like a cloud. These comparisons are catchy, but ultimately misleading. False analogies can also be used as a weapon in debates to manipulate opinions. A politician might say that this tax is like theft, establishing a false moral equivalence between taxes and theft. A speaker might argue that censorship is like slavery, exaggerating the consequences of a policy by comparing one situation with another with very different interests. False analogies distort reality and provoke emotional rather than rational responses. The key to detecting a false analogy is to ask whether the similarities are relevant or whether the differences are more important. A good analogy clarifies, but a bad one distorts. If two things share only superficial traits but have completely different functions, the analogy crumbles under careful examination. When an argument is based on a simplistic comparison, it is better to delve deeper and look beyond the surface. By questioning analogies and recognizing when they are exaggerated, we can avoid being deceived by arguments that sound convincing but ultimately do not stand up to logic. Loaded question. A journalist addresses a politician and asks, "Why are you ignoring the needs of working families?" The politician stutters, caught in a trap. Regardless of how he responds, he has already been accused of ignoring those families. Even denying the premise makes them seem offensive. The question was not neutral. It was designed to force a certain assumption. It is a loaded question, a question that contains an implicit presumption that makes it impossible to answer without appearing guilty. Have you stopped lying to your partner? Whether the person answers yes or no, they are trapped. The question assumes that he has been lying. Why you hate dogs? If the person tries to deny it, they still seem guilty of not liking dogs, rather than allowing an open debate. Instead of open discussion, a loaded question pressures the person to give a limited and misleading answer. It works because people react emotionally to accusations. A loaded question creates an immediate sense of guilt, forcing the person to defend themselves instead of addressing the real issue. Politicians use it to frame their opponents, lawyers use it in interrogations, and the media uses it to stir up controversy in personal conversations. It is a common tool for manipulation. Why do you never think about my feelings? Assumes that the other never does, instead of leaving room for debate. This fallacy is especially effective in debates because it subtly controls the conversation. The person who answers must not only answer, but also dismantle the hidden assumption. The trap works even better when the public is unaware of the tactic. If a journalist asks a chief executive, "Why has your company put profits before safety?" it immediately paints the company negatively. Even if the chief executive gives a rational explanation, the question has already influenced the public's perception. The fallacy of the loaded question is especially dangerous because, instead of seeking the truth and preventing honest debate, it pressures people to adopt a defensive stance. It often appears in moral debates and social issues. Why do you support policies that harm the poor? Assumes the harm is intentional. Why are you against progress? Assumes disagreement stems from a refusal to improve. This type of question does not allow for thoughtful debate. It forces the opponent to fight against a deceptive premise instead of arguing their actual position. The best way to counter it is questioning the assumption behind the question. That question takes for granted something untrue. Instead of responding directly, one can reframe the debate by exposing the question's bias itself. Recognizing the trap allows you to return to reality and avoid being cornered by an unfair question. Learning to detect loaded questions is an essential skill in critical thinking, as it helps separate genuine inquiry from rhetorical manipulation. Appeal to ignorance. A guest on a late-night talk show leans in and says there is no evidence that aliens do not exist, so they must be out there. The public nods, intrigued, but is the lack of evidence really evidence? Just because something has not been disproven does not mean it is true. Similarly, someone could argue that there is no evidence that telepathy does not work, so it must be real, but the absence of evidence is just that, an absence. It tells us nothing about what is or is not true. That is appealing to ignorance, arguing that a claim must be true because it has not been proven false, or that something must be false because it has not been proven true. A conspiracy theorist claims that no one has ever proven that the government hides secret experiments. A skeptic argues that there is no evidence that ghosts exist, so they cannot be real. Both assume that ignorance in itself and the absence of evidence are sufficient to settle the discussion, but real knowledge requires more than just the absence of contradictions. This works because uncertainty makes people feel uncomfortable. If there is no clear answer, we feel compelled to fill the gaps with certainty, declaring something true or false based solely on a lack of information. This fallacy is especially common in debates about science, politics, and the supernatural. People may argue that alternative medicine works simply because it has not been disproven, or that a political scandal must be real because no evidence has emerged to refute it. Superstitions and urban legends thrive on this fallacy. If no one can prove that a myth is false, it continues to circulate as a possible truth. This fallacy also plays a role in legal discussions and historical debates. A defendant could say that there is no evidence that he was at the crime scene, so he must be innocent, ignoring the fact that the lack of evidence does not confirm innocence. Similarly, a historian could argue that there is no evidence that this civilization did not have advanced technology, so perhaps it did. While open-mindedness is of value, assuming that something is true just because it has not been disproven is intellectually lazy. Appealing to the fallacy of ignorance is dangerous because it shifts the burden of proof. Instead of backing up their claim with evidence, a person demands that others disprove it, but proving a negation is often impossible. Just because we have not found evidence of something does not mean it is real or false. The only rational approach is to base beliefs on positive evidence, not on the absence of rebuttals. Science, for example, does not assume that something exists until it has been observed and verified. If we took everything for granted until proven otherwise, we would have to believe in all the myths, conspiracies, and rumors that have been told. The next time someone claims, "You can't prove I'm wrong, so I must be right," ask them if there is any real evidence to support that claim, or if there is just an empty space where proof should be. If a claim is based solely on the lack of contradiction, then it has no more weight than an assumption. Real truth is not found in ignorance, but in facts, evidence, and verifiable data. The difference between speculation and knowledge is the presence of something real and measurable. Appeal to tradition. A company resists change by arguing that we have always done it this way, so it must be the best way. But is longevity proof of quality? Just because something has been done a certain way for generations does not mean that it is the correct or most effective approach. Traditions can be valuable, but they should not be unquestioned. Some traditions endure because they have a useful purpose, while others are maintained simply because no one has questioned them. The key is knowing how to distinguish between the two. That is appealing to tradition, arguing that something is good, right, or better simply because it has been practiced for a long time. Marriage has always been between a man and a woman, so it must remain so. We have used this method for centuries, so there is no need to change it. This festival has existed for hundreds of years, so it must continue. The argument assumes that antiquity alone confers legitimacy, ignoring whether the practice is still valid according to modern understanding or whether there is new evidence. If time alone were proof of efficacy, then old medical treatments such as bloodletting would still be widely used. It works because people find comfort in tradition. Change is disturbing, and things that have endured for generations seem trustworthy. An ingrained custom is perceived as a pillar of stability, and questioning it can seem like an attack on the identity of a culture, a family, or a society. But time by itself does not determine the truth. Slavery, bloodletting, and alchemy were ingrained traditions until they were abandoned for justified reasons. The fact that something has been done for centuries does not mean that it is wise, ethical, or effective. The fallacy of appealing to tradition is common in politics, education, and social norms. A company resists innovation by claiming that this is how it has always worked. A school insists on obsolete teaching methods because they worked in the past. A legal system clings to old laws and refuses to reform because they have always existed. In some cases, traditions persist because they actually work, but in others they are maintained out of habit, even when better alternatives exist. For example, the keyboard layout of typewriters was designed to slow down typists on old typewriters, but it is still the norm today, even though more efficient layouts exist. It was designed to slow down typists on old typewriters, but it is still the current standard even though more efficient designs exist. Tradition can offer wisdom, but it can also be a barrier to progress when followed blindly. Some of the greatest advances in history came from questioning old customs and finding new solutions. Scientific discoveries, social reforms, and technological innovations often require breaking with traditional thinking. However, not all traditions should be discarded. Some have cultural, historical, or emotional value. The challenge is knowing when a tradition has a meaningful purpose and when it simply persists because no one has questioned it. The key to overcoming this fallacy is to ask whether this practice still makes sense today. The age of tradition does not make it right or wrong, but its effectiveness, its ethics, and its relevance. The best ideas withstand scrutiny, not just the passage of time. If a tradition is worth preserving, it must be able to stand on its own merits, not just on the weight of history. Questioning traditions does not mean rejecting the past, but ensuring that the future is built on the best possible foundations. The appeal of novelty. A technology company presents its latest smartphone. It is the newest model, so it must be the best to date, according to advertising. But is the new automatically better? The fact that something is recent does not mean that it surpasses the previous. Progress is real, but not all changes are an improvement. Some innovations perfect what works, while others introduce unnecessary complexity or abandon valuable features in the name of modernity. That is appealing to novelty, the assumption that something is superior simply because it is new or modern. This is the latest diet, so it must be more effective than the old ones. Our new educational system will revolutionize learning. This new medicine is better than all previous treatments. The claim assumes that novelty alone guarantees improvement, regardless of whether the change is significant or beneficial, without evidence. Assuming that an update or a new method is automatically an improvement is a misleading way to justify decisions. It works because people associate progress with innovation. We are programmed to believe that the newest is smarter, faster, or more advanced. Marketing exploits this trend. Brands launch new and improved versions of products, even when the differences are minimal or cosmetic. Consumers are attracted to updated packaging, redesigned logos, and modernized brands, even when the basic product remains the same. But history shows that the newest is not always better. Some modern trends disappear, while older ideas, methods, and technologies remain useful. Vinyl records have come back into fashion despite digital streaming. Ancient architectural techniques still outperform modern construction in some cases. Many old books, movies, and philosophies remain timeless, proving that progress does not always mean abandoning the past. The fallacy of the appeal of novelty appears in technology, business, science, and social policies. A new application promises to make life easier, but its functions are less useful than those that already existed. A company switches to an innovative management style that causes more confusion than productivity. A political movement insists that tradition must be abandoned simply because it is old, even when old systems worked well. Even in medicine, the newest medicine is not always the best. Some old treatments are still more effective, while newer ones may have unforeseen side effects. The true progress comes from testing and evaluating the changes, not from blindly assuming that the latest version is always superior. The best way to avoid this error is to ask if it is truly better or just newer. Novelty alone is not proof of quality. Although change can be positive, it should be accepted based on merit, not just because it is different from the previous one. Real progress is measured by results, not by date. Instead of assuming the latest version is automatically an improvement, critical thinkers should ask themselves what this change really brings and if it solves real problems. If the only argument in favor of updating it is that it's new, then the change could have more to do with perception than real value. Appeal to consequences. A man refuses to believe a scientific theory because, he argues, if it were true, life would not make sense. I refuse to accept such a depressing idea. But reality does not change because we dislike its implications. The truth remains the truth, regardless of whether we find it comforting or disturbing. Accepting or rejecting something based on its emotional impact does not make it more or less real. That is appealing to the consequences, arguing that a claim must be true or false based on its possible consequences rather than on the evidence. If evolution were true, human beings would not be special. So it must be false. If my political candidate lost fairly, that would mean our system is broken. So they must have cheated. If climate change is real, we would have to change our way of life. So it must be exaggerated. These arguments are not based on facts, but on personal preferences, fear, or illusions to dismiss reality. When truth depends on what is comfortable instead of demonstrable, rational debate breaks down. It works because people want the world to fit their values and desires. Difficult truths challenge beliefs, identity, and security. People resist ideas that make them uncomfortable and prefer conclusions that reaffirm their vision of the world. But the truth is not determined by how much we like it. Believing in something because it is comforting does not make it real, just as rejecting something unpleasant does not make it false. Reality is indifferent to our hopes, fears, and emotions, and discovering truth often requires facing ideas that may be disturbing. The fallacy of appealing to consequences appears in debates about science, politics, religion, and ethics. A person argues against artificial intelligence, not because of technical defects, but because they fear its impact on employment. A student rejects a historical fact because it makes his nation look bad. A religious leader dismisses new research because it contradicts ingrained beliefs. These arguments avoid addressing whether the claim itself is true and instead focus on whether the consequences are desirable. The fallacy is also common in moral debates where someone might argue that if morality is not given by a higher power, then life has no purpose, so morality must come from a higher power. But the fact that something is meaningful or lacks purpose does not determine if it is true. The best way to avoid this fallacy is to ask if this argument is based on evidence or simply on whether I like the result. The truth does not adapt to convenience. Facts remain facts, however much we wish they were different. Instead of rejecting an idea because of its consequences, critical thinkers focus on whether the evidence supports it, because reality does not care about our preferences. Accepting difficult truths allows for better decisions, while denying them only delays the inevitable. The more we focus on what is instead of what we wish it was, the more clearly we can see the world as it is. False balance. A news anchor introduces a debate tonight. We debate about climate change. On the one hand, a climate scientist. On the other, a businessman who says it's a hoax. You will decide. The public assumes that both opinions are equally valid. But are they really? One is supported by an overwhelming scientific consensus, while the other is based on personal beliefs. Presenting them as equals induces the public to think there is a real controversy when there is not. That is a false balance, also known as both sidesism, the fallacy of giving equal weight to two sides, even when the evidence overwhelmingly supports one. Doctors say smoking causes cancer, but a researcher disagrees, so the jury has not decided yet. Most historians agree that this event occurred, but a blog says otherwise, so we must consider both points. Scientists confirm that vaccines are safe, but some parents say they are not, so both points of view deserve the same broadcast time in each case. The position defended by Wells is treated as if it were as uncertain as a marginal belief. It works because people value is not so both opinions deserve the same broadcast time. In each case, the position backed by Wells is treated as if it was as uncertain as a marginal belief. This works because people value fairness. Presenting both sides seems balanced, even when the sides lack equal credibility. Journalists and media often fall into this trap, giving a platform to conspiracy theories, marginal science, or misinformation under the pretext of neutrality. But the truth is not opinion, it is based on evidence. Giving an unfounded opinion the same legitimacy as a position established by facts creates confusion, not clarity. False balance is often confused with false equivalence. But there is a key difference. False equivalence occurs when two things are falsely compared as if they were similar in nature when they are not, such as equating small ethical errors to large-scale corruption. False balance, however, presents two sides of an argument as equally valid, even when one is overwhelmingly supported by evidence and the other is not. Both fallacies deceive people, but false balance distorts the perception of credibility. The fallacy of false balance is especially dangerous in science, history, and public policies, since it allows misinformation to spread by making it appear a valid perspective. Climate change denial, anti-vaccine rhetoric, and pseudo-history thrive on false balance, when false claims are treated as serious alternatives to facts backed by Wells. People have difficulty telling truth from misinformation. The best way to counteract false balance is to ask yourself, does this argument have real evidence, or is it being supported to appear impartial? Fair balance must come from the truth, not from giving the same weight to ideas that are not supported by the same level of evidence. True impartiality is not about presenting both sides, but presenting reality. Appeal to flattery. A salesman smiles and says, "You seem like someone with very good taste. This watch would be perfect for someone as elegant as you." By flattering them, the client feels special, more likely to trust the seller and make the purchase. But does his compliment improve the watch, or is it just a tactic? Flattery creates an emotional connection that makes the person feel recognized and appreciated, which lowers their defenses against persuasion. That is appealing to flattery, using compliments and praise to manipulate someone into accepting an argument or making a decision. You are a very intelligent investor. I know you will see why this stock is a great opportunity. You are an open-minded person. You will agree with me on this issue. Only someone with a refined palate can truly appreciate this wine. Flattery is not just a compliment. It is a tool to circumvent critical thinking and make the person feel valued, pushing them toward agreement. The strategy is especially effective because people tend to trust those who make them feel good. It works because people like feeling good about themselves. Compliments increase confidence, and when someone flatters us, we instinctively want to maintain the positive image they have given us. This fallacy is common in sales, marketing, and persuasion. Advertisers use slogans such as "for those who demand the best" to make customers feel superior. Politicians flatter voters to win their support with slogans such as "the working people of this country know what is right." In conversations, people can use flattery to influence opinions without offering real evidence. Employers can use flattery to persuade employees to take on more work by making them feel indispensable instead of compensating them fairly. A teacher can use it subtly to encourage students to adopt a particular point of view. Only the brightest students recognize the importance of this theory. These examples show how praise can be used as a tool of persuasion rather than genuine compliments. The appeal to flattery is deceptive because it replaces logic with emotion. When decisions are influenced by compliments rather than facts, the argument itself may lack weight. This fallacy can be dangerous when it leads people to ignore warning signs, make bad investments, or support weak arguments simply because they like how they are spoken to. The next time someone appeals to your ego, ask yourself, is this argument solid, or am I just enjoying the compliment? Real decisions must be based on reason, not on how good they make us feel. Recognizing when flattery is used to manipulate allows us to keep our feet on the ground and think rationally, instead of being carried away by emotions. Appeal to compassion. A student who realizes that he has failed an exam approaches his teacher and says, "If I don't pass this subject, I will lose my scholarship and disappoint my family. Please, couldn't you give me a few more points?" The teacher hesitates, feeling compassion, but do the student's difficulties change the fact that he has not obtained the necessary grade to pass? This is a classic example of ad misericordiam, a Latin term meaning appeal to pity, in which an emotional plea influences judgment instead of relevant evidence. It is appealing to pity using emotions, particularly sympathy and guilt, to persuade someone to accept an argument rather than relying on logic or evidence. "You can't fire me. I have a family to support. I deserve this job because I have had a hard life. You should vote for me because I have overcome many adversities." While personal struggles may be real and moving, they do not necessarily justify the conclusion argued. A compelling story does not make a weak argument strong, and suffering alone does not prove merit. It works because human beings are empathetic by nature. We do not want to see others suffer, and we feel the need to help when facing difficulties. However, making decisions based on pity rather than facts can result in poor reasoning. A court should not acquit a guilty person just because they had a difficult childhood. A company should not hire an unqualified candidate just for having gone through difficult times. Emotional appeals can cloud judgment and lead to decisions based on pity rather than merit. The fallacy of appealing to compassion is often used in advertising, politics, and personal discussions. An advertisement for a charitable organization may show heartbreaking images of suffering animals, implying that donating is the only moral option. A politician may emphasize their personal difficulties to gain sympathy rather than discussing policies. A defendant in a court may exaggerate their tragic background to obtain leniency, even if the evidence is against them. In everyday life, people can manipulate others by making them feel bad. If you were a good friend, you would help me. But compassion alone does not make an argument valid. This fallacy can be especially powerful when it appeals to guilt. If an emotional plea is rejected, The person making it may feel cruel and ignore logic to avoid discomfort. However, justice means applying the same criterion to everyone, without letting emotions override reason. The best way to counter this fallacy is to separate emotions from reasoning. Feeling compassion is important, but decisions should be made based on justice, facts, and logic. The next time someone makes an emotional appeal, ask yourself if their difficulties really prove their argument or if they are just a distraction from the real problem. True justice comes from the balance between empathy and reason. Compassion should guide kindness, but it should not replace critical thinking. Appeal to fear. A politician takes the stage and warns that if he is not voted for, the economy will collapse and crime will skyrocket. The crowd becomes tense. The message is clear. Not voting for this candidate is not just a choice, it is a danger. But is there real evidence to support these claims, or is fear being used as a weapon? Fear bypasses logical analysis and pushes people to act out of urgency rather than reason. Appeal to fear using threats, anxiety, or the worst possible scenarios to manipulate someone into accepting an argument, even when the evidence does not support it. If you do not buy this security system, your family will be in danger. If we do not ban this technology, it will destroy society. If you do not support this policy, the future of your children will be doomed. The argument is not based on facts, but on the fear of what could happen if the other decision were made. Fear makes people more reactive, which often leads to hasty or irrational decisions rather than careful evaluation. It works because fear is a powerful motivator. When people feel threatened, they focus on avoiding harm rather than analyzing the logic of an argument. Reasoning based on fear is common in politics, marketing, and the media. The media sensationalizes dangers to maintain the interest of viewers. Advertisers use fear to sell products. Use this toothpaste, or you will get cavities. Leaders stoke fear of foreigners to gain support, provoking an emotional reaction. These arguments bypass critical thinking and push people toward a specific conclusion. Once fear is activated, the rational part of the brain takes a back seat, making people more susceptible to persuasion and manipulation. The fallacy of fear is especially dangerous because it encourages decisions based on emotions rather than facts. It can lead to paranoia, irrational policies, and unnecessary restrictions. A government may justify mass surveillance by exaggerating threats to national security. A company may pressure customers to make unnecessary purchases by making them fear a hypothetical danger. A parent may oppose a new teaching method, not because it is ineffective, but because they fear it may ruin education. A health guru may claim that processed foods cause certain diseases without scientific support. In all cases, fear itself becomes the argument, rather than evidence or reason. The goal is not to provide evidence, but to create enough panic so that people stop questioning the logic behind the claim. This fallacy is often used in conjunction with other fallacies that we have discussed previously, such as the false dilemma, which consists of posing a problem as if there were only two extreme options, or the slippery slope, which suggests that one action will inevitably lead to a catastrophe. By combining fear with these techniques, an argument becomes even more difficult to refute, as people are forced to adopt a survival mentality rather than a rational consideration. The best way to counter this fallacy is to ask yourself if this claim is supported by real evidence or if it is just playing on fear. Instead of reacting emotionally, look for facts. Are there credible data to support the danger being presented? Is the risk being exaggerated? Fear can alert us to real dangers, but it should never replace reason. The strongest arguments are based on truth, not terror. The more we recognize the tactics of fear for what they are, the better we can resist being manipulated by them. Appeal to rancor. A man is watching a political debate. A candidate proposes a new health policy, but instead of addressing its merits, a commentator says, "Are you really going to support them after what their party did to you in the last election?" The argument is not based on logic or politics, but on clinging to resentment. The discussion goes from evaluating the policy itself to stirring up old wounds, reinforcing division instead of fostering rational decision-making. That is appealing to rancor, using bitter resentment or past grievances to dismiss an argument instead of addressing its validity. Do not buy from that company. Do you remember how they raised prices last year? Why should we listen to him? He made us look ridiculous at the last meeting. You should not support that new initiative. Those people have never supported us before. These arguments are not about whether something is true, fair, or beneficial, but turn the discussion into a matter of revenge instead of a reasoned assessment. It works because resentment is a powerful motivator. People naturally hold grudges, and emotions like rancor or revenge can override rational thinking. When a decision is posed as a way to get revenge on someone, people focus more on settling scores than making a logical decision. This fallacy often appears in politics, business rivalries, and personal relationships. A politician may urge voters to reject a policy simply because it was proposed by an opponent. A company may encourage customers to switch brands by reminding them of a competitor's past mistakes. A friend may pressure someone to take sides in an argument by stirring up old resentments, even in historical disputes. Nations have prolonged conflicts based on past grievances instead of focusing on present realities. This fallacy is also common in work dynamics and social interactions. An employee may refuse to collaborate with a colleague due to a previous disagreement, even if working together would benefit the company. A sports team could reject the hiring of a talented coach simply because he once worked for a rival team. Rancor can creep into any aspect of decision-making, turning what should be a practical assessment into an emotional reaction rooted in the past. The fallacy of rancor is dangerous because it diverts attention from the facts to feelings of hostility. It fosters division, prevents progress, and can lead to erroneous decision-making simply to satisfy a personal rancor. Important decisions should be based on reason, not personal resentment. The best way to counter this fallacy is to ask yourself, am I rejecting this idea because it is wrong or simply because I do not like the person or group that defends it? True impartiality comes from judging ideas on their merits, not on past conflicts. Rancor may be satisfying at the moment, but it rarely leads to good decisions. The more we let reason guide our choices, the less likely we are to fall victim to emotional manipulation. Appeal to ridicule. A scientist explains a complex theory, and instead of addressing the evidence, his opponent smiles wryly. So you expect me to believe that we come from monkeys? That is ridiculous. The argument is not about facts. It is about making an idea seem ridiculous so that people dismiss it without considering its validity. Instead of responding with logic, the opponent resorts to sarcasm and exaggeration to make the idea seem absurd. This tactic does not address the argument itself. It simply dismisses it with mockery. That is resorting to ridicule, mocking an idea instead of addressing it logically. Sure, let us give everyone free health care and see how it works. So, do you think we should listen to scientists about climate change? We'll be next. Ask fortune tellers for advice about the stock market. Believing in evolution is like believing in magic. Instead of refuting the argument with facts, ridicule is used to make the opposing point of view seem absurd or foolish. The goal is not to refute the idea, but to make people feel ashamed for even considering it. It works because people fear being laughed at. If an idea is presented as ridiculous, those who support it may hesitate to defend it for fear of looking foolish. When an argument is dismissed with mockery, people are forced to become defensive, which makes them more likely to withdraw instead of continuing to participate. This fallacy is common in debates, politics, the media, and even everyday discussions. A politician can dismiss an opponent's policy with sarcasm instead of refuting it with evidence. The host of a talk show may mock an academic study instead of explaining why it might be wrong. A person in a discussion may roll their eyes and say, "Great, another conspiracy theorist," without addressing the real points being raised. This tactic is especially effective when combined with an audience. If a person ridicules an argument in front of a group, others may hesitate to refute it for fear of also becoming the object of mockery. That is why ridicule is so often used in public debates, online discussions, and social settings. It takes advantage of social pressure to silence disagreement. In some cases, This fallacy can be combined with the straw man fallacy, in which an argument is distorted into an exaggerated and absurd version before being ridiculed. For example, someone who defends the regulation of gun ownership might encounter, so you just want the government to take away all our rights and ban everything. We'll be next banning kitchen knives. This misrepresentation presents the original argument and makes it seem ridiculous, even though the real claim was much more reasonable. The appeal to ridicule is dangerous because it prevents rational debate. Instead of debating the facts, it relies on shame, which makes people reluctant to question the mockery. It discourages independent thought by creating a hostile environment where people fear looking foolish. Over time, this fallacy can contribute to the spread of false information, as ideas are discarded without adequate examination. The best way to counteract this fallacy is recognizing that laughter is not an argument. Question: is this idea really being addressed? Is it really being addressed, or is it simply being dismissed with sarcasm? If an argument is truly weak, it should be easy to refute without mockery. Instead of being intimidated by ridicule, challenge the person to explain why they think the argument is wrong. If they cannot give a serious answer, it is a sign that their mockery is a distraction, not valid criticism. When someone resorts to ridicule, it is often a sign that they lack a solid counterargument. Rational discussions should be based on evidence and reasoning, not on fear of looking foolish. Appealing to money. A man enters a car dealership and points to the most expensive model. This has to be the best, he says. It costs twice as much as the others. But is price really an indicator of quality? Or is he assuming that a higher cost automatically means superiority? This assumption is common, but it ignores the reality that price often includes factors that have nothing to do with quality, such as brand, marketing, or artificial scarcity. That is appealing to money. The fallacy of assuming that something is better, more valuable, or more correct simply because it costs more, or that something is inferior because it is cheaper. The most expensive university must offer the best education. This wine costs $500 a bottle, so it must taste incredible. The opinion of a billionaire is more valid than that of a normal person. Price and value are not always related, but this fallacy leads people to equate wealth with quality, truth, or intelligence. It also works in reverse. People can dismiss something as bad simply because it is cheap, even if it offers excellent value. It works because people associate cost with prestige, exclusivity, and desire. Luxury brands promote themselves in this way, creating the illusion that higher prices automatically mean higher quality. But history shows that expensive things are not always better. Some of the best books are free in libraries. Some of the greatest artists died poor, and expensive treatments are not always more effective than affordable ones. On the other hand, a low price does not always mean that something has no value. Affordable innovations, efficient designs, and economical solutions often outperform their expensive counterparts. Many technological advances began as low-cost alternatives to overvalued solutions, but then proved superior. This fallacy also plays an important role in social perceptions and decision-making. A rich person's opinion may carry undue weight in a discussion simply because of their financial success, even if their experience has nothing to do with the topic at hand. In an education, students may be convinced that an expensive private university automatically offers a better education than an affordable public one, even though factors such as faculty quality, curriculum, and student outcomes are much more important. In the world of art and collectibles, some people take it for granted that an expensive painting is automatically more meaningful or aesthetically superior to a lesser-known work with a more modest price. Price is often a reflection of demand and marketing, rather than intrinsic value. The appeal to money fallacy appears in business, education, marketing, and personal judgments. A person may assume that an expensive private school offers a better education than a well-regarded public school. A customer may dismiss a cheaper phone as low quality, even if it has the same features as a premium model. A politician may argue that the perspective of a wealthy donor is more important than that of the working class. Some even assume that an expensive wedding or engagement ring is a stronger sign of love, even though studies show that there is no correlation between the cost of a wedding and long-term marital success. Although money can be an indicator of resources, it does not intrinsically prove value, correctness, or truth. The best way to counteract this fallacy is to ask yourself whether the price really reflects quality or just perceived value. True value is measured by function, effectiveness, and substance, not just by the dollar sign. Just because something is expensive does not mean it is better, and just because something is cheap does not mean it is worthless. The real question should always be what this price really represents. Looking beyond the cost and focusing on real quality and utility is key to avoiding this misleading assumption. Appealing to common practice. A businessman defends his company's decision to pay its employees less because all companies in the sector do so. That is how the business works. But does the fact that a behavior is widespread make it right? Just because something is common does not mean it is ethical, fair, or logical. Normalizing an action through repetition does not justify it, but many people fall into this trap when they assume that what is common is correct. That is appealing to common practice, the fallacy of assuming that something is acceptable, justified, or correct simply because it is commonly done. Everyone cheats on their taxes, so it must be okay. People have always exaggerated their resumes to get a job. Most drivers exceed the speed limit, so it is not really a big deal. Instead of demonstrating that an action is correct or reasonable, this argument simply points to popularity as justification. If enough people participate in a practice, it seems like a tacit rule, making it easier to ignore the ethical concerns behind it. It works because people find comfort in familiarity. If many people do something, it creates the illusion that it must be acceptable. This fallacy is common in work cultures, legal arguments, and social behaviors. A student caught plagiarizing could argue that everyone copies homework. Sometimes, a politician might justify corruption by saying that this is how politics has always worked. A company might continue with an unfair pricing model because all competitors do it. People assume that if something is widespread, it must have been tested and accepted as the correct way to do things, even if it is fundamentally flawed. This fallacy is especially powerful because it exploits social conformity. When people see others participating in a behavior, they feel pressure to follow it, regardless of whether they believe it is correct. This is how toxic corporate cultures, unethical legal loopholes, and social injustices persist. A doctor could continue prescribing an obsolete treatment because it is what everyone else does. A judge may maintain a biased legal precedent because the courts have always ruled that way. A company may exploit its workers because it is the norm in the sector. It is assumed that since something has been done for a long time, questioning it is unnecessary. The fallacy of appealing to common practice is dangerous because it allows unethical, harmful, or illogical behaviors to persist simply because they are widespread. It discourages critical thought and reform. Many historical injustices, from segregation to unsafe working conditions, were considered normal at that time. If common practice were always correct, there would be no progress. If everyone in the past had accepted the status quo without questioning it, we would never have had democracy, civil rights, or scientific advances. The fact that a practice is common does not mean it should continue. This fallacy is often accompanied by the appeal to tradition, in which something is defended not only because it is common now, but because it has been common for generations. Both assume that mere repetition is proof of correctness, instead of evaluating the practice for its actual merits. However, the appeal to common practice focuses on the present, arguing that since many people do something now, it must be acceptable, while the appeal to tradition invokes the past as justification. The best way to counter this fallacy is to ask yourself, would it be acceptable if only one person did it? Or am I simply excusing it because it is common? Imagine that a single company paid its employees poorly, or if only one driver violated traffic laws. The fact that many people do something does not change its logical or ethical validity. Right and wrong are determined by logic, ethics, and justice, not by the number of people who participate in a behavior. The fact that something is widespread does not mean it should be accepted. Questioning norms is the first step towards progress, and challenging common practices allows for meaningful change instead of blind conformity. Appeal to motive. A journalist presents evidence in favor of a new environmental policy, but their opponent dismisses it outright. You only say that because you work for an environmental group. Instead of addressing the argument itself, they attack the speaker's motive as if having an interest in a topic automatically makes someone wrong. This tactic diverts attention from the validity of the argument and focuses it on the person presenting it, creating the illusion that the motive is more important than the reasoning. That is an appeal to motive. The fallacy of dismissing an argument based on the perceived motivations of the person making it, rather than addressing the argument itself. Of course, scientists say climate change is real. They get funding for their research. You only support this law because it benefits your industry. The teacher is against budget cuts in schools because they only want a raise. In all cases, attention is diverted from the actual reasoning and focused on the person's intentions, as if their motive alone invalidates their argument. This reasoning assumes that if someone can benefit from something, their position must be dishonest, even if their claim is valid. It works because people are naturally skeptical of biases. If someone seems to gain from their argument, we instinctively question their sincerity. Although motives can influence opinions, they do not determine whether an argument is true or false. A scientist can benefit from research funding and still be right about climate change. A teacher may want a better salary and have valid concerns about school funding. A lawyer may want to win a case and defend a legally sound position. Rejecting a claim solely because of the interests of the person expressing it ignores the strength of the evidence and prevents constructive debate. The fallacy of appealing to motive is common in politics, business, and social debates. A politician may dismiss a journalist's criticism by saying that they are only trying to sell newspapers. A company may ignore workers' complaints by arguing that they only want more money. A defendant in a criminal trial could argue that the prosecutor is only bringing charges because they want a promotion. A chief executive accused of environmental violations could say that activists are only attacking because they have an anti-business agenda. In all these cases, the focus is on discrediting the speaker instead of examining the argument itself. This fallacy is also closely related to the ad hominem, in which an argument is discarded by attacking the person making it instead of the argument itself. However, the appeal to motive focuses specifically on why someone makes a claim instead of addressing its truth. While it is fair to question conflicts of interest, a motive does not automatically invalidate an argument. The best way to counter this fallacy is to ask, even with a motive, is their argument valid? The truth is determined by facts and reasoning, not a person's intentions. Instead of focusing on why someone believes something, focus on whether what they say is correct. Motives may exist, but they do not replace evidence. An argument must be sustained or refuted based on logic, and not on speculations about the speaker's personal interests. Appeal to probability. A player watches the roulette and says that red has come up 5 times in a row, so black has to be next. But just because something is probable does not mean that it is certain. Probability does not guarantee a result, but many people mistakenly believe that past events influence future probabilities in random events. This misunderstanding fuels bad decisions, false assumptions, and needless anxiety. That is appealing to probability, the fallacy of assuming that because something is statistically probable, it will happen. If you don't buy insurance, you will regret it someday. There's a 70% chance of rain, so we are sure to get wet. Most startups fail, so yours is doomed from the start. In each case, probability is confused with inevitability, which leads to false conclusions. A statistical probability does not mean absolute certainty, and assuming that it does can lead to bad decisions. A statistical probability does not mean absolute certainty, and assuming that it does can lead to bad decisions. It works because people rely on patterns and expectations to make sense of the world. We assume that trends should continue in a predictable way, even when randomness or uncertainty play an important role. This fallacy is especially common in gambling, risk assessment, and decision-making. A person might avoid flying because planes sometimes crash, ignoring that the actual probability is low. A job applicant may assume that they will not be hired, as most applicants do not get it, regardless of their individual qualifications. Investors may believe that, as a stock has steadily risen in value, it must continue to rise, ignoring the unpredictability of financial markets. These errors stem from the tendency to confuse probability with certainty, leading people to overestimate or underestimate risk. This fallacy also affects personal decision-making. Someone might avoid starting a company because most fail in the first 5 years, not realizing that factors such as preparation, industry, and strategy play a role. A person might assume that because their family has a history of heart disease, they are sure to develop it as well, neglecting lifestyle habits that could reduce the risk. Fear-based assumptions derived from probability can prevent people from taking worthwhile risks or seizing beneficial opportunities simply because they misinterpret statistical probabilities as inevitable realities. The fallacy of appealing to probability is dangerous because it leads to excessive reasoning and wrong decisions. Assuming that an outcome is certain can lead to overconfidence, unnecessary fear, or inaction. In business, it can cause entrepreneurs to give up too soon or take reckless risks. In science, it can lead to misinterpretations of data, in which researchers assume that a correlation implies causation. In everyday life, it can lead to missed opportunities, reckless investments, or unnecessary worries. This fallacy is also often associated with the gambler's fallacy, in which people assume that previous events influence future ones. For example, when flipping a coin, someone might think that since heads has come up several times in a row, tails has to come up the next time. While it is true that probability influences decision-making, it cannot predict with certainty what will happen in a particular case. Recognizing this difference is essential for avoiding erroneous reasoning. The best way to counter this fallacy is to ask yourself whether the outcome is certain or just probable. Probability can provide useful information, but it should never replace logical analysis. The probability of an event occurring is not the same as its certainty, and failure to recognize this difference can lead to irrational fears, bad investments, and wrong reasoning. A better approach is to weigh probability along with context, evidence, and independent factors, ensuring that conclusions are based on logic and not on assumptions. Resorting to force. An employee is called to their boss's office. The conversation begins amicably, but then comes the ultimatum. I assume you will support my proposal at the next meeting. It will be a shame if you lost your promotion because of this. There is no debate or discussion, just a subtle threat wrapped in courtesy. The argument is not based on facts or logic, but on power and control, making compliance seem the only option. That is resorting to force, a tactic that replaces reasoning with coercion. Instead of persuading someone with evidence, they are pressured to accept through intimidation or the threat of negative consequences. If you don't agree with me, you'll regret it. If you don't support this policy, you'll be fired. If you don't believe what I say, you'll be punished. The argument itself does not have to be solid, since if the person receiving it is too afraid to question it, the philosopher is punished. The argument itself does not need to be solid if the person receiving it is too afraid to question it. The fallacy works because it eliminates rational discourse, leaving only submission or risk. Fear is a powerful motivator when faced with a risk of damage, whether physical, economic, social, or emotional. Most will choose survival over confrontation. That is why this fallacy appears often in politics, workplaces, and personal relationships. A government can silence critics by threatening them with jail. A company can pressure its employees to adopt a certain position by insinuating that the security of their job depends on it. A father can tell his son that he better believe what he says, or, if not, fear replaces debate and disagreement becomes too costly, which prevents people from evaluating the validity of an argument because they are more focused on avoiding punishment than on seeking the truth. This fallacy not only silences people, but fosters an environment where compliance is confused with consensus. When people pretend to agree out of fear, erroneous ideas persist unchallenged over time. Intimidation becomes the norm, eroding critical thinking and creating a culture in which power dictates truth. Leaders who use force instead of persuasion shape a society where questioning authority is considered dangerous. In these environments, misinformation spreads easily because those who recognize flaws in an argument hesitate to express themselves. The absence of dissent does not indicate that something is correct, only that people are too afraid to express disagreement. The fallacy of appealing to force often appears with ad hominem attacks or false dilemmas. For example, a leader could say that anyone who opposes this policy is a traitor, immediately branding critics enemies and pressuring them to remain silent. Similarly, a company executive could state that you're either with the company or against it, implying employees must choose between absolute loyalty or losing their careers. These rhetorical tactics strip individuals of their right to debate, replacing pursue. Could state that you're either with the company or against it, implying that employees must choose between absolute loyalty or losing their career. These rhetorical tactics strip individuals of their right to debate, replacing persuasion with fear-driven compliance. Resisting this fallacy requires courage and critical thought. Separate the argument from the intimidation behind it. Ask, is this claim supported by logic, or is fear being used as reasoning substitute? If an idea can only survive through coercion, it probably will not withstand scrutiny. Persuasion comes from evidence, discussion, and rational thought, not pressure or threats. By recognizing these tactics, individuals can regain their ability to think freely and make decisions based on logic, not fear. Argument from silence. A historian examines an ancient text and observes it never mentions a particular battle. Since the text does not mention the event, they conclude it must never have happened. But is the absence of evidence evidence of absence? The simple fact that something is unrecorded does not mean that historical records often exist that are incomplete, selective, or have been lost, making silence an unreliable basis for drawing conclusions. That is the argument from silence, the fallacy of assuming if there is no evidence or mention of something, then it must not be true. If he did not deny the accusation, it must be true. No one has complained about the new policy, so everyone must like it. There are no records of this tradition before the 19th century, so it must not have existed before. In each case, silence is confused with proof of non-existence, although the absence of evidence could have many explanations. The lack of written documentation does not mean that an event, belief, or practice never occurred. It only means we lack direct evidence of it. This fallacy works because people expect complete records and immediate answers. If something is true, they assume it should have been documented or recognized. However, historical events may not be recorded for countless reasons. The lack of sources that have survived, deliberate suppression, or simple irrelevance to those in charge of the records of the time. Some ancient civilizations relied primarily on oral traditions rather than written records, meaning many important events may never have been recorded. Similarly, a person's silence does not always indicate guilt or agreement. They may not be aware of the accusation, may choose to ignore it, or may consider it does not deserve a response. Assuming that silence is an admission of the truth oversimplifies complex human behavior and ignores alternative explanations. The argument from silence is common in historical research, legal cases, and everyday assumptions. A prosecutor could argue that the defendant never denied the charges, so he must be guilty. A researcher could claim that there are no writings about this civilization practicing medicine, so they must not have had doctors. A journalist could assume that the company did not respond to the allegations, so they must be true. In all these cases, the lack of response or record is treated as definitive proof, even when alternative explanations exist. Silence could be a strategic decision, an indication of irrelevance, or simply a case of lack of evidence that has not yet been found. This fallacy also appears in scientific debates, where skeptics dismiss theories or discoveries simply because they have not yet been observed. We have never detected extraterrestrial life, so it must not exist. No one has ever seen a black hole directly, so it might not be real. Scientific progress is full of discoveries that were previously unrecorded until the evidence appeared. Assuming that something does not exist simply because it has not been observed is a reasoning error that overlooks the possibility of future discoveries. To avoid falling into this fallacy, ask yourself, does the lack of evidence mean that something has never happened, or could there be another reason for the silence? Consider whether records have been lost, whether events were unimportant to the keepers of memory, or whether there has simply not been enough research. The fact that something is not mentioned does not mean it did not exist. True conclusions must be based on evidence, not its absence. The lack of evidence does not automatically equate to proof of absence, and recognizing this distinction is crucial for sound reasoning and informed decision-making. Carefully select the claims of a company that says that its product is the best on the market in a study that has shown that it outperforms its competitors. What they do not mention is that the study was financed by their own team, while several independent studies found no advantage. The company did not lie. It simply omitted inconvenient details by selecting only the most favorable evidence. They create a misleading impression that makes it appear that their claim has universal support, when in reality, the complete picture tells a different story. Is to selectively select the evidence that supports a claim and ignore the data that contradicts it. This athlete has won 5 games in a row without mentioning he lost 10 before. Crime is at its lowest level, but only in one city, while crime rates nationwide are increasing. This diet has proven its effectiveness based solely on success stories, rather than considering the complete picture. Selective selection presents a biased version of reality that favors one side of an argument. The fallacy is based on the assumption that people will not look beyond the information provided, allowing an incomplete data set to be considered proof. This fallacy works because people are naturally drawn to evidence that confirms their beliefs. If a claim seems convincing, we tend to focus on information that supports it and overlook contradictory details. Politicians use it to drive narratives, advertisers use it to sell products, and the media use it to create engaging headlines. A lawyer may highlight the favorable testimony of a witness and ignore contradictory accounts. A climate change skeptic may point to a cold winter as proof that global warming is not real, ignoring decades of rising temperatures. A pharmaceutical company may promote a new drug by highlighting a single successful study and ignoring multiple trials that showed minimal benefits or concerning side effects. By emphasizing only the evidence that fits their argument, cherry pickers create a misleading sense of certainty. This fallacy is particularly effective because it is based on a partial truth, unlike absolute falsehoods, which can be easily refuted. Cherry picking manipulates reality by presenting only a portion of the available data. The claims may not be technically false, but they distort the truth by omitting important counterarguments. This makes the fallacy more difficult to detect, as the public may not realize that there is additional contradictory information that has been intentionally omitted. Selective selection is also dangerous because it fuels misinformation and reinforces biases. If someone already believes in a particular point of view, they're more likely to accept selective evidence that confirms it rather than seeking a balanced perspective. This fallacy plays a key role in conspiracy theories, in which isolated facts are chained together to create a misleading narrative, while all contradictory evidence is ignored. It also influences scientific and medical misinformation, where people select isolated studies or anecdotal evidence to support controversial or discredited claims. To counter selective selection, ask what evidence is being omitted. Look for sources that provide a complete view rather than relying on selective information designed to drive an agenda. A claim should be judged by the totality of the evidence, not just the parts that support it. Truth comes from considering all relevant information, not just the convenient pieces. Critical thinking requires recognizing the gaps in an argument and questioning whether the evidence presented represents the complete picture or just a curated selection intended to deceive. Definition: a debate develops about intelligence, and a person claims that anyone with a high IQ is intelligent. But when presented with examples of people with a high IQ who make bad decisions, they change the rules. Well, True intelligence is not just IQ. It is also wisdom and good judgment. The definition silently changes to avoid contradiction, making the argument impossible to refute. What was originally a rigid definition of intelligence suddenly becomes flexible, ensuring that the speaker never has to admit he was wrong. That is retreating in the definition. The fallacy of subtly redefining a term when faced with counterarguments to protect an original claim from refutation. A true athlete must be in full physical shape until someone points out a successful athlete with a physical disability. Art is only what is exhibited in a museum until examples of famous street art are mentioned. True democracy requires full citizen participation until low voter turnout is mentioned. Each time the definition is adjusted to avoid admitting that the claim was too rigid or incorrect, instead of refining their position based on counterarguments, the person simply changes the terms to maintain the illusion of coherence. This fallacy works because definitions shape arguments. If a claim is based on a specific definition, changing that definition in the middle of the debate allows a person to circumvent refutation without directly admitting their mistake. It allows them to change the meaning of words to fit their preferred conclusion, rather than recognizing that the original definition was too narrow or flawed. This tactic also makes it frustratingly difficult to engage in a meaningful discussion, as the definition continues to evolve enough to keep the original claim intact, no matter how much evidence is presented against it. The definitional retreat fallacy is common in discussions about identity, philosophy, and abstract concepts. A person might argue that success means financial wealth, but when faced with happy and fulfilled people who are not wealthy, they adapt. True success also has to do with personal achievements. A coach may claim that only the best players are part of the team, then redefine best to include attitude and commitment when a more talented player is excluded. A politician might claim that we have full employment, but when pressed on underemployment and job quality, he redefines employment to include part-time, temporary, or low-wage work. These changing definitions make it impossible to engage in a fair debate because the rules are constantly changing, making the argument unfalsifiable. This fallacy is especially problematic in scientific and legal debates. If someone argues that a drug is safe and then redefines safe to mean it only has mild side effects, they have retracted their original claim without admitting it. In legal debates, someone might say that a law protects freedom of expression, but when asked about cases in which it restricts freedom of expression, they redefine freedom of expression to mean only freedom of expression protected by the government, instead of expression without limitations. By constantly adjusting the definitions, people create an illusion of correctness when, in reality, they are avoiding genuine debate. To counter this fallacy, ask if the definition changed during the argument. If a term continues to evolve to evade valid counterarguments, it is a sign that the original claim was erroneous. Another strategy is to establish clear definitions at the beginning of a debate to avoid backtracking later. Arguments should be based on clear and stable definitions, not on words that change each time they are questioned. If it is necessary to modify a definition to maintain a claim, the claim itself is likely not firm from the beginning. False precision. A politician takes the stage and declares that our new policy will create exactly 3,405 2,876 jobs in the next 5 years. The number sounds impressive, but can employment growth really be predicted with such precision using an excessively precise figure? The speaker makes their claim seem more credible than it actually is. Specificity creates the illusion of certainty, even when reality is full of variables, unpredictable economic factors, and assumptions that could easily change over time. That is false precision, the fallacy of using an exact or very specific number to create an illusion of precision, even when the underlying data is uncertain or defective. This investment strategy has a success rate of 9,843%, without explaining how that figure was calculated. The half-life of this product is 1,276 years, as if such precision were significant or even measurable. Crime rates have increased exactly by 43.27 this year. Ignoring the potential margin of error, inconsistent reporting methods, or differences in data collection among jurisdictions. In all these cases, concrete figures create an illusion of certainty where there is none, inducing people to think that the claim is more reliable than it truly is. This fallacy works because people associate precise numbers with reliability. A claim that sounds mathematically rigorous seems more authoritative than a vague statement, even if the numbers themselves are arbitrary or misleading. Advertisers use false precision to make products seem superior, often highlighting very specific effectiveness percentages that may not withstand scrutiny. Financial analysts rely on it to make their predictions seem more credible, even when stock markets and economic trends are intrinsically unpredictable. Even in scientific debates, precision can be misused to exaggerate confidence in uncertain data by adding extra decimal places. An argument may seem more objective than it actually is, taking advantage of the assumption that accuracy equates to truth. The fallacy of false precision is especially misleading in economics, medicine, and public policy. A study may claim that this drug is 9,238% effective, but if the sample size is too small, the methodology is flawed, or the margin of error is large, the figure is meaningless. A company might boast that its sales have increased by 17,294% in the last quarter, when rounding to 17% would be more honest and would reflect the true variability of the financial data. A government official might claim that tax cuts will increase the GDP by exactly $12,648 billion, even though economic forecasts are highly uncertain and depend on many unpredictable factors. The false sense of accuracy distracts from the broader reality. Some things simply cannot be measured with such precision, and the attempt to do so often misleads rather than informs. This fallacy is also frequently used in surveys and statistics. A survey might claim that 6,327% of voters support a policy, but if the margin of error is plus or minus 4%, the actual level of support could be significantly different. Weather forecasts might predict that there is a 6,739% chance of rain tomorrow, but meteorology is based on probability models, and adding unnecessary decimals does not make the forecast more reliable. In medical research, a study on diets may claim that participants lost an average of 8,935 pounds in 6 months, although the actual weight loss fluctuates and varies greatly among people. These very specific figures create a false impression of precision, when in reality a rounded or more generalized figure would be just as informative, if not more honest. To counter this fallacy, ask yourself if this level of precision makes sense. If a claim presents a very specific figure without explaining how it was calculated, it may be designed to deceive. Look for the origin of the number. Examine if rounding would significantly change the meaning, and consider if the level of detail provided is even realistic. Genuine precision is based on a solid methodology, not on unnecessary decimals. Precision without context is just a trick to make weak arguments seem stronger. The more precise a claim seems, the more carefully it should be examined to ensure that the numbers serve the truth and not illusion. Fallacy of presentism. A modern critic analyzes a 19th century novel and says that this author was clearly sexist and outdated, that no one should read their works. But is it fair to judge people of the past with today's moral and cultural standards? Can historical figures and societies be expected to think and act as we do now? That is the fallacy of presentism, the error of applying contemporary values, beliefs, or knowledge to judge the past, while ignoring the historical context. Medieval doctors were ignorant because they did not understand germ theory. Were the founding fathers hypocritical because they did not support universal suffrage? Were ancient civilizations primitive because they lacked modern technology? These claims assume that people from earlier eras should have had access to knowledge, values, and perspectives that did not yet exist, and dismiss the realities of their historical context. This fallacy overlooks the gradual nature of social and scientific progress and assumes that historical figures were deliberately ignorant, rather than recognizing the intellect of their era. This fallacy works because modern people often assume that our current values are the definitive norm, forgetting that societies evolve. Although some beliefs of the past may seem obviously wrong today, they were often shaped by the cultural and intellectual limitations of that era. Judging historical figures by modern ethical standards can erase the complexities of history, preventing us from understanding how and why societies changed. It also leads to dismissing important historical figures who played a role in shaping the progress that allows us to criticize them today. The fallacy of presentism is especially common in debates about history, literature, ethics, and politics. A historian might dismiss an ancient legal system as barbaric without considering its purpose at that time. A student might reject reading classic books because they contain obsolete ideas, missing the chance to learn about the period they reflect. A political movement might completely condemn historical figures instead of recognizing their flaws and contributions. This oversimplification distorts history, making it difficult to appreciate progress and to understand how societies evolve. It also creates a dangerous precedent where historical figures are judged without nuance, leading to cultural erasure rather than meaningful analysis. Interestingly, the fallacy of presentism is the opposite of the historical fallacy, which assumes that the conditions of the past can be recreated in the present, while presentism unfairly applies modern values to the past. The historical fallacy erroneously assumes that the systems or solutions of the past can be transplanted to the modern world without changes. Both distort history, one oversimplifying the past as morally inferior and the other idealizing it as a perfect model for today. To avoid this fallacy, ask yourself, am I judging the past fairly, or am I imposing current values? Understanding history means recognizing its complexity, acknowledging both progress and imperfection, and learning how different periods shaped human thought. The past must be studied in its own context, not rewritten to suit current sensibilities. Appreciating history for what it was, rather than what we wish it had been, lets us learn from it without distorting reality. His historical fallacy. A politician argues in the 1950s that families were stronger and crime rates lower, and that we must return to those values to fix today's society. But is history really that simple? Are past conditions directly responsible for past results? And can they be replicated in a completely different era? This type of reasoning assumes that historical circumstances can be copied and pasted into the present, ignoring the social, economic, and cultural changes that have since taken place. That is a historical fallacy, an erroneous reasoning that assumes past events, trends, or conditions apply directly to the present or future without regard to context, complexity, or change. Ancient civilizations lived in harmony with nature, so their way of life must have been superior. Medieval societies were deeply religious, and people were happier then. The Great Depression demonstrates that the stock market will plummet and exist again exactly the same. These claims oversimplify history, assuming that past patterns must repeat exactly or that past successes can be recreated without regard for the broader circumstances that shape them. They also ignore that historical records themselves are often incomplete, biased, or interpreted through modern perspectives that distort what actually happened. This fallacy works because history provides compelling narratives. People look for lessons in the past, but the misuse of history can lead to misguided policies, nostalgia-driven decisions, and unrealistic expectations. Historical comparisons often ignore social, cultural, and technological changes. A business leader could argue that we should adopt the same strategies that made this company successful in the 1980s, overlooking how technology, markets, and consumer behavior have changed. A nation could implement policies inspired by a past economy without recognizing the unique factors that contributed to that success. Similarly, a school board could promote traditional educational methods without considering how modern research has refined our understanding of learning. The historical fallacy is especially misleading in politics, economics, and social debates. A leader could claim that tax cuts led to economic growth in the past, so it will work exactly the same now, regardless of different economic conditions, changes in global trade, or inflation. A historian could argue that empires always collapse after 300 years, ignoring the unique circumstances of each case and treating history as an inevitable cycle rather than a complex interaction of forces. A health expert could say that our ancestors followed this diet, so it must be the healthiest option, regardless of differences in lifestyle, medical knowledge, and environment. This fallacy can also be seen in personal arguments. Someone might say that their grandfather never went to college and was successful, so higher education is no longer important, ignoring how economic opportunities and the job market have changed over time. This fallacy is often related to presentism, which consists of judging historical figures or societies using modern moral standards, assuming that past cultures should have behaved the same way we do today. Conversely, it can also manifest in Golden Age thinking, in which a past era is believed to have been objectively better and that returning to those values will solve modern problems. Both distort the complexities of history, reducing it to a simplistic lesson rather than an evolving story shaped by countless variables. To avoid this question, are the past and present really comparable, or are key details being ignored? History provides information, but it does not repeat itself with exact patterns. A proper analysis requires understanding not only what happened, but also why it happened and whether those conditions still exist. Instead of using history as a rigid model, it should be treated as a guide to understanding human behavior, systemic change, and the unpredictable nature of progress. Moralistic fallacy. A speaker argues that violence is wrong, so human nature must be inherently peaceful. But does morality determine reality? Just because something should be a certain way does not mean that it is. Human nature and social structures do not always align with our moral expectations, and assuming they do can lead to distorted conclusions. That is a moralistic fallacy. The mistaken belief that if something is morally desirable, then it must also be a factual or natural truth. Racism is wrong, so human beings must be born completely free of prejudice. All people are equal, so there are no biological differences between men and women. A healthy diet should not cause weight gain, so calories should not matter. These arguments confuse how things should be with how they are. Assuming that reality must conform to human values does not dictate biology, psychology, or sociology, but is a human construct that often exists in tension with natural tendencies and social realities. This fallacy works because people want morality and nature aligned. We prefer to believe that goodness and justice are interwoven into the fabric of existence, but reality is often more complex. Natural selection, for example, favors survival and reproduction over fairness. Emotions such as jealousy and aggressiveness have evolutionary roots that persist despite our ethical condemnation. Similarly, although we believe that economic inequality should not exist, market forces, resource distribution, and human behavior make total economic equality almost impossible. The inability to distinguish moral ideals from empirical truths can lead to the denial of facts and erroneous attempts to reshape reality based on illusions rather than evidence. The moralistic fallacy is common in debates about science, politics, and ethics. A politician might argue that war is immoral, so it should be avoided in all cases, ignoring historical conflicts driven by survival and power struggles. A health expert might argue that all children should have the same learning abilities, so intelligence differences must be caused solely by the environment, dismissing genetic influences on cognition. A sociologist might argue that crime should not exist in a just society, so social programs alone should be enough to eliminate it, overlooking other contributing factors such as psychological predispositions, socioeconomic conditions, and the effectiveness of law enforcement. These arguments fail because they assume that moral beliefs prevail over physical and social realities, when in reality, both must be taken into account in problem solving. This fallacy also appears in discussions about gender, psychology, and medicine. Someone might claim that men and women should be exactly the same, so any difference must be due solely to cultural conditioning, ignoring biological influences on behavior and physical abilities. A mental health advocate might say that people should be able to control their emotions, so mental illnesses must be purely a matter of willpower. Disregarding the role of neurobiology in genetics and medicine, a patient might believe that natural treatments are better because nature would not create harmful substances, ignoring the fact that many natural compounds are toxic, while many synthetic drugs save lives. These examples illustrate how moral reasoning can cloud scientific and practical understanding. To counter this fallacy, ask yourself, am I assuming something is true just because I think it should be? Morality guides how we want the world to be, but facts describe how the world is. Effective change comes from first recognizing reality and then working to improve it, rather than reshaping facts to fit moral ideals. Progress is best achieved by accepting the evidence as it is and developing ethical solutions that work within the real limitations of human nature, biology, and social structures. Nirvana fallacy. A critic dismisses a renewable energy plan saying that wind and solar energy are not perfect, that the sun does not always shine and the wind does not blow, and that we should continue to use fossil fuels. But is the presence of defects enough to reject an idea completely? Does a solution have to be perfect to be worthwhile? Demanding perfection in any policy, product, or decision ignores the reality that progress is achieved through gradual, not sudden, improvements. Perfection is the nirvana fallacy, the mistaken belief that if a solution is not flawless, it must be completely useless. Vaccines are not 100% effective, so they do not work at all. Public transport has delays, so a failure. Recycling does not eliminate all waste, so there's no point in doing it. This type of reasoning assumes that unless a system solves all problems perfectly, it must be abandoned completely. It ignores the real benefits and the fact that almost all practical solutions involve trade-offs. This fallacy works because people are naturally attracted to absolutes. If something is not a perfect solution, they assume it must be fundamentally flawed. However, real-world systems are complex, and almost all decisions involve balancing advantages and disadvantages. Medicine has side effects, governments make mistakes, and technologies have limitations, but that does not mean they are not valuable. Discarding something just because it is not ideal prevents progress and fosters cynicism. The world works in shades of gray, not black and white. Perfection and the pursuit of absolute solutions often lead to paralysis rather than action. The nirvana fallacy is common in debates about politics, technology, and social issues. A politician might argue that this health reform does not solve all the problems, so it is a failure, ignoring the important improvements it brings. A skeptic might say that electric cars still depend on fossil fuels for their production, so they do not help the environment at all, ignoring the fact that they reduce emissions overall. A business leader might argue that telecommuting is not as efficient as offices, so it should be eliminated, overlooking the benefits of flexibility and increased productivity for many employees. Instead of evaluating whether a solution improves things, this fallacy unfairly demands an impossible standard of perfection that leads to stagnation rather than progress. This fallacy also appears in personal decision-making. Someone might avoid exercising because it does not make me lose weight overnight, or refuses to start a project because it will not be perfect at first. Perfectionism, in this sense, is a close relative of the nirvana fallacy, leading people to dismiss progress simply because the end result will not be flawless. The reality is that improvement is almost always gradual, and small steps in the right direction are much better than doing nothing at all. To counter this fallacy, ask yourself, does this solution improve things, even if it is not perfect? Rejecting progress in search of perfection can lead to missed opportunities and stagnation. An imperfect but functional approach often outweighs the risks of doing nothing. Progress occurs through incremental, not instantaneous, improvements. To recognize that all solutions have limitations allows us to focus on what works and build on it, instead of rejecting useful ideas simply because they are not perfect. Fallacy of reification without law. A student says that science has demonstrated that the universe wants us to be happy, but does it really want it? Does the universe want something? Can an abstract concept like science have desires or intentions? To treat an idea as if it had real physical agency is a common but deceptive way to argue. Although this type of language can be poetic or persuasive, it often obscures who or what is really responsible, leading to confusion instead of clarity. That is the fallacy of reification, the error of treating an abstract concept as if it were a concrete physical entity with its own thoughts, desires, or actions. Justice demands that we act. Society has decided that this is unacceptable. History will remember our decisions in each case. An abstract idea is personified, endowing it with agency that it does not really possess by attributing human intentions to intangible forces. This fallacy makes complex questions seem more absolute than they are. It also diverts attention from the real people, institutions, or systems responsible for shaping events, which can make it difficult to analyze or effectively question those forces. This fallacy works because personification makes ideas seem most powerful and authoritative. If science says something, it sounds more convincing than admitting that individual scientists interpret data and form theories. If history teaches us something, it implies an objective lesson instead of recognizing that historians analyze and debate past events. When vague entities such as destiny or the market are treated as active forces instead of as sets of human decisions, responsibility is eliminated and critical thinking is replaced by illusion, by assuming that abstract forces operate independently of human influence. This fallacy gives the false impression that certain results are inevitable or unquestionable. The fallacy of reification appears frequently in politics, philosophy, and the media. A leader could say that the economy is angry, suggesting that economic trends have emotions instead of being the result of policies and human behavior. A motivational speaker could affirm that the universe will reward you for thinking positively, implying that a vast cosmos has a personal interest in individuals. A legal analyst could argue that the law must find justice, when in reality the laws do not find anything, but rather it is people who interpret and apply them. A business executive could say that the market will correct itself, as if economic trends acted on their own instead of being shaped by the actions of investors, companies, and regulators. This type of reasoning creates an illusion of inevitability or authority where it does not exist, allowing those in power to evade their responsibility by blaming abstract concepts instead of human decisions. This fallacy also plays a role in personal decision-making. A student could say that destiny will decide if he enters the university, instead of recognizing that preparation and effort play an important role. A person who struggles for his career could declare that success comes to those who wait, instead of recognizing the need to act and plan, attributing results to vague personified forces. People run the risk of giving up control over their own lives and decisions, believing that external forces dictate their destiny instead of their own actions. To counteract this fallacy, ask yourself who or what is really making a decision. Clarifying who is responsible forces one to be more precise in arguments and prevents vague abstractions from diverting the debate. When you face affirmations that attribute human qualities to abstract concepts, question by identifying the true agents of change. Reality is determined by actions, not by imaginary forces that act on their own. By resisting the temptation to simplify complex issues through personification, we can think more critically, demand accountability from the right people, and better understand the true causes behind events. Self-contradictory argument. A conspiracy theorist claims that the government is hiding evidence of the existence of aliens. When asked to provide evidence, he responds that, of course, there is no evidence because the government is hiding it. Regardless of the counterargument presented, the affirmation is designed to protect itself from being refuted. Not only is it difficult to refute, but it is structured in such a way that any attempt to refute only reinforces belief in itself. The argument is sealed against scrutiny, which makes it impermeable to logic or evidence sight, is a self-closed argument, a fallacy in which an affirmation is structured in such a way that it cannot be refuted, regardless of the evidence. If you don't agree with me, that just shows that you are too brainwashed to understand. All successful people follow this mentality. If you're not successful, it is because you have not followed it correctly. This theory is true for those who are enlightened enough to see it. These arguments are rigged to be unfalsifiable, making them impossible to prove or debate. Instead of defending his affirmation with logical reasoning, the person changes the argument to make it immune from criticism. This fallacy works because it blocks critical thinking instead of allowing debate. It dismisses all opposition as proof of its own correctness. It appears frequently in pseudoscience, conspiracy theories, cult-like belief systems, and ideological debates. A guru could say, "If my methods don't work for you, it's because you haven't believed enough." A political activist could argue that anyone who does not agree with this policy is part of the problem. A business consultant could affirm that this strategy always works and that, if it has not worked for you, it is because you have done it wrong. These affirmations create a vicious circle in which disagreement only reinforces the argument instead of questioning it. No matter what evidence against is provided, the affirmation is designed to discard them before they can be seriously considered. The fallacy of the self-sealing argument is dangerous because it prevents a meaningful debate, since it discards counterarguments without considering them, making an honest debate impossible. If an affirmation cannot be proven or questioned, it becomes a dogma instead of a reasoned position. This fallacy also fosters intellectual arrogance, since those who use it often refuse to recognize alternative points of view. Over time, it can lead to the isolation of ideas within ideological echo chambers, where only those who already agree are considered credible. This fallacy is often related to circular reasoning, in which the conclusion is taken for granted in the premise, and ad hominem, in which criticisms are discarded based on personal attacks instead of on their arguments. For example, a self-sealing affirmation could affirm that only intelligent people understand this argument, and that, if you do not agree, that only proves that you are not intelligent. This tactic discourages genuine debate by framing disagreement as proof that the opponent is not qualified to argue. To counteract this fallacy, ask if there is any possible way to prove that this affirmation is false. If an argument is designed to deflect all criticisms instead of facing them, it is not based on reason, but a belief that refuses to be questioned. True knowledge comes from arguments that can be proven, questioned, and refined, not from those that are closed to scrutiny. A solid argument must be open to possible refutation, because the truth can withstand examination. When you encounter a self-testing affirmation, challenge the person to specify what kind of evidence, if any, would make them reconsider their position. If they cannot answer, it is a sign that their belief is not based on logic, but on a self-reinforcing illusion, a fallacy of illusory thinking. A student takes a look at their textbook without opening it the night before an exam and says to themselves, "I will do well, I have a good feeling," but their confidence is a substitute for preparation. The fact that we want something to be true does not mean that reality will cooperate. Positive thinking can be useful to motivate action, but it does not substitute real effort, planning, or preparation. Expecting the best without addressing the real obstacles leads to failure more often than success. That is the fallacy of illusory thinking, the erroneous belief that something is true simply because it is desirable for it to be. I know that my business idea will be successful because I really believe in it. If we think positively, everything will be all right. Bad things will not happen to me because I am a good person. In each case, the person assumes that their hopes or desires influence reality, instead of considering the real evidence, logic, or risk factors. This way of thinking often substitutes analysis with optimism, which leads people to discard legitimate warnings or concerns in favor of blind faith. This fallacy works because optimism feels good. People prefer to believe in favorable results instead of facing uncertainty, effort, or unpleasant possibilities. It is comforting to think that the universe rewards good intentions, but reality is often indifferent to personal beliefs. When people rely solely on illusions, they do not recognize potential risks and do not take the necessary precautions. A student who assumes that they will pass without studying is condemning themselves to failure. An entrepreneur who refuses to take into account market trends because they simply know that their idea will work risks losing everything. Ignoring reality in favor of positive thinking can lead to making erroneous decisions, to a lack of preparation, and to unrealistic expectations. Hope alone does not create success, but planning and action do. The fallacy of illusory thinking appears frequently in business, politics, and personal decisions. A leader could argue that if we approve this law, everything will improve without taking into account possible complications or unforeseen consequences. An investor could suppose that these stocks will go up because they want them to, ignoring market trends, financial indicators, or economic recessions. A person in a toxic relationship could insist that they will change because they love them, even when the evidence suggests otherwise. Athletes can convince themselves that they will win because they believe in themselves, without taking into account the need to practice, develop skills, or prepare strategically. This mentality substitutes careful evaluation with emotional preference, which leads to making decisions based on fantasy instead of facts. This fallacy is especially dangerous because it encourages inaction. If someone truly believes that good things will happen simply because they must, they may not take the necessary measures to guarantee a good result. A government that takes for granted that the economy will recover without intervention can ignore the warning signs of a financial crisis. A person who takes for granted that their health will improve simply because they believe in a positive result could neglect medical treatment. Believing in success is not the same as working to achieve it, and taking for granted that the universe will align to grant personal desires can be a recipe for disaster. To counteract this fallacy, ask yourself if there is real evidence that that is going to happen, or if you're only hoping that it will happen. A more effective approach is to combine optimism with realism, recognizing the potential for success, but also preparing for the difficulties that may arise along the way. Positive thinking is valuable, but it must be accompanied by logic, effort, and a willingness to adapt when reality does not conform to expectations. Wishing for the best is fine, as long as it does not substitute reason, decision-making, and tangible actions. Fallacy of reductionism. A scientist explains human consciousness as a series of chemical reactions in the brain. Although technically true, does this explanation really capture the depth of human thought, emotions, and experiences? By oversimplifying a complex phenomenon, the affirmation reduces it to something far less significant. Human experiences imply complex interactions between biology, personal history, environment, and culture, none of which can be fully explained by a single, simplified cause. That is the fallacy of reductionism, the error of oversimplifying a complex topic to a single cause or component, while ignoring its broader context. Love is just a chemical reaction. The economy is based solely on supply and demand, and depression is just a lack of serotonin. These claims may have some truth, but they discard the complexity of the topic, treating it as if it were nothing more than its most basic elements. While breaking things down into simpler components can help to understand them, it becomes a fallacy when it excludes crucial factors that influence the entire system. This fallacy works because simplification makes things easier for understanding. People prefer direct answers to complicated questions, and breaking things down into simple explanations is satisfying. However, many systems, whether biological, social, or philosophical, are too complex to be reduced to a single factor. Oversimplification can lead to erroneous policies, flawed scientific interpretations, and a misunderstanding of reality. By focusing only on one element of a system, the interconnected nature of complex issues is ignored, which can lead to ineffective solutions or completely erroneous interpretations. The fallacy of reductionism is common in science, psychology, politics, and everyday reasoning. A political official could argue that crime is due to poverty, ignoring factors like education, social structures, and mental health. A business leader could say that success is due solely to hard work, without recognizing privileges, opportunities, and market conditions. A medical expert could claim that obesity is due solely to calories ingested versus calories burned, oversimplifying the role of genetics, hormones, and lifestyle factors. While these claims contain partial truths, they ignore the big picture, leading to superficial conclusions and ineffective solutions. In science, reductionism is often opposed to holistic approaches. While breaking down a system into individual components can lead to valuable insights, it becomes a fallacy when it is assumed that understanding the parts automatically means understanding the whole. For example, knowing the properties of individual neurons does not fully explain consciousness. Similarly, in medicine, treating only the symptoms of a disease without considering environmental or psychological factors can lead to an incomplete treatment strategy. Reductionist thinking can limit progress when it ignores the ways in which multiple factors interact. This fallacy is also frequently observed in political debates. A candidate may claim that the reason for unemployment is laziness, ignoring automation, educational systems, economic recessions, and changes in labor markets. Another may argue that gun violence is caused by violent video games, without considering social conditions, gun laws, and mental health issues. These overly simplistic explanations appeal this fallacy. Ask yourself what is being omitted in the explanation. Understanding complexity requires taking into account multiple influences rather than reducing everything to a single cause. Instead of looking for a single answer, ask yourself how different factors interact to create a broader outcome. Although simplification is useful for learning, it should never be done at the expense of precision or depth. Accepting complexity allows solving problems more effectively, gaining a deeper vision and understanding the world with greater precision. The fallacy of the romantic rebel critic dismisses a popular book saying that if the masses love it, it must be superficial and unoriginal. But does popularity automatically make something bad? Just as some assume that a belief is correct because many people hold it, others reject ideas because they are widely accepted, falling into the trap of contrary thinking. The assumption is that truth, authenticity, or quality only exist in opposition to general acceptance, leading to the automatic rejection of anything popular, regardless of its actual merits. That is the fallacy of the romantic rebel, the erroneous belief that something is false, inferior, or unworthy simply because it is mainstream, conventional, or widely accepted. If everyone supports this movement, it must be corrupt. If a film is critically acclaimed, it is probably overrated. True artists are not recognized in their time, so anything popular is not real art. These arguments assume that the truth or value of an idea is determined by how much or how little society accepts it. However, discarding something simply because it has great appeal is as intellectually lazy as accepting something uncritically because everyone else does. This fallacy works because people idealize individuality and rebellion. The idea of opposing the crowd has an emotional appeal that makes someone feel enlightened, unique, or superior for rejecting what others accept. There is a cultural fascination with the solitary genius, the misunderstood artist, or the outsider who sees the truth while the masses remain ignorant. However, rejecting something just because it is popular is no more rational than accepting something just because it is popular. Popularity does not make something good or bad by nature. It simply reflects that it has gained followers, and its merits should be evaluated independently of its level of appeal to the majority. The fallacy of the romantic rebel is essentially the opposite of the bandwagon effect fallacy, which assumes that something is true or good simply because it is widely accepted. While bandwagon thinking leads people to follow the crowd uncritically, romantic rebellion leads them to reject the crowd without critical sense. Both fail to address ideas based on their actual merits, substituting independent thinking with automatic opposition or conformity. One blindly follows the majority, while the other blindly opposes it, but neither approach involves true critical thinking. This fallacy frequently appears in art, politics, and intellectual debates. A student might insist that he only reads obscure literature, that bestsellers are for the uninformed. A critic might claim that if a politician has broad support, he must be corrupt. A music fanatic might say that once a band becomes famous, it sells out and loses its originality. In reality, some bestsellers are deeply insightful, some widely supported politicians are genuinely good leaders, and some famous musicians retain their art despite commercial success. Popularity, while it can sometimes indicate mediocrity or compromise, does not automatically indicate a lack of quality, depth, or value. This fallacy can also lead to impractical decision-making. A person could reject proven medical treatments in favor of alternative remedies simply because conventional medicine supports the former. An entrepreneur could ignore well-established business strategies because they are too conventional, only to later face unnecessary setbacks. A film buff could refuse to see blockbuster movies on principle, thus missing truly great cinematographic works. In each case, the rejection of the conventional is based on an instinctive aversion to popularity, rather than on a well-reasoned critique of the content itself. To counter this fallacy, ask yourself if I reject this idea for its flaws or simply because it is widely accepted. True independent thinking means evaluating arguments and works on their actual merits, without taking for granted that going against the grain always gives you reason. Being a critical thinker does not mean following or rejecting trends blindly, but forming opinions based on thoughtful consideration of evidence, reasoning, and experience. Rebellion for rebellion is as wrong as blind conformity, the simpleton's fallacy. A scientist presents a complex explanation of climate change full of data and models. A skeptical response: if it's so complicated, then you don't really understand it. But is it necessary for something to be simple to be true? Some ideas are intrinsically complex and require depth, nuances, and careful study. Discarding them simply because they are difficult to explain leads to misunderstandings and the rejection of valuable ideas. The term fallacy of the simpleton is borrowed from a novel by Walter M. Miller Jr. from 1960, A Canticle for Leibowitz, in which not knowing is so despised that people greet each other with a good simpleton. This fallacy assumes that complexity means deception or incompetence, which discourages the pursuit of deeper understanding. Isaac Asimov described a version of it: the false notion that my ignorance is as good as your knowledge. This mentality promotes the idea that all perspectives are equally valid, even when one is based on rigorous analysis and the other on superficial reasoning. That is the fallacy of the simpleton, the belief that if an explanation is complex, it must be erroneous, too complicated, or intentionally misleading. If you can't explain it simply, it's because you don't understand it. If this law is complicated, it must be corrupt. A real solution shouldn't require so many steps. Although simplicity is useful, not all truths can be condensed without distorting the meaning. Some topics, such as climate science, medicine, and law, require detailed explanations that cannot be fully understood in a brief statement. People are attracted to simplicity. Easy answers are satisfying, while complexity requires effort. However, science, economics, medicine, and law involve intricate systems that cannot always be reduced to a single cause. When people demand simple explanations, they often end up with misleading or incomplete conclusions. The President of the United States, Barack Obama, warned in 2016 that, in politics and in life, ignorance is not a virtue. Rejecting complexity under the guise of being realistic or honest is a way of dismissing expertise in favor of emotionally appealing but objectively incorrect narratives. This fallacy frequently appears in politics, science, and social debates. A politician might say that fixing the economy is simple: just lower taxes, ignoring the broader impact on public services, income inequality, and national debt. A conspiracy theorist might claim that if climate change were real, it would be explained in a single sentence, dismissing decades of research and a wealth of empirical data. A person struggling to lose weight might insist that slimming down is just a matter of eating less and moving more, ignoring factors such as genetics, metabolic disorders, and psychological influences in each of these cases. An oversimplified explanation prevents a more nuanced and accurate understanding of the problem. This fallacy is especially dangerous because it discourages deeper investigation. If people believe that complex answers are convoluted, they may reject expert knowledge in favor of simplistic but false explanations. This trend influenced the 2016 U.S. presidential election, in which the rejection of expertise and simplistic messages influence public discourse. When voters are encouraged to believe that complex political issues have obvious solutions, they may overlook the need for in-depth analysis and well-informed decision-making. A notable example of this fallacy is found in the 1994 film Forrest Gump, where the protagonist's simplistic view of the world is celebrated, reinforcing the idea that there is no need to think deeply. Although the film presents Forrest as an adorable and kind character, it subtly promotes the idea that intelligence and complexity are overrated and that wisdom comes from a lack of intellectual curiosity, even if appealing. This idealization of simplicity can dissuade people from embracing the depth needed to address real-world problems. The fallacy of the simpleton is closely related to the false dilemma and the fallacy of reductionism, which assume oversimplified answers to complex problems. The term has also been used to describe a deceptive tactic in which someone feigns ignorance to force their opponent to give excessive explanations rather than avoid debate. For example, during a political debate, a candidate might say, "I may not be a brilliant economist, but I simply don't see how raising taxes helps workers. Can you explain it to me in simple terms?" This tactic forces the opponent to go on the defensive, simplifying a complex issue and implying that any explanation is an attempt to hide the truth. To counter this fallacy, ask, is this really as simple as it seems, or is important information being ignored? Although clarity is valuable, the truth is not always simple. Recognizing complexity is a sign of deeper understanding, not ignorance. The most important discoveries of science philosophy and ethics have been built on the willingness to address difficult questions rather than dismissing them as unnecessarily complicated. And with this, we finish with logical fallacies. Now that you know how they work, you will start detecting them everywhere. In the news, in debates, in advertisements, and even in informal conversations. But here is the real challenge. Have you detected any fallacy in real life while watching this video? Leave a comment if you found it interesting. Do not forget to hit the like button, since that helps more people see this content. And if you want to further sharpen your critical thinking, subscribe so you do not miss the next video. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.